begin to know the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
All right, the next one here, U.S. weapons in Ukraine funneled to arms traffickers and criminals. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and it says that the Pentagon Inspector General found the arms Washington sent to Kiev did not undergo the required inspections. A report from the Inspector General found weapons the U.S. sent to Ukraine in the hands of criminals and on the black market. So the Arms Control Act requires that the White House establish an inspection system for weapons that the U.S. sells or gifts to third countries. And this law mandates the monitoring continues to the end use of the weapon. In Ukraine, the embassy in Kiev has been assigned responsibility for monitoring the weapons transfers. The Department of Defense Inspector General report on American weapons transfers to Ukraine from February to September of last year found that legally required monitoring was not taking place. This report said, quote, "The DoD is unable to conduct end-use monitoring in Ukraine because completing end-use monitoring in accordance with DoD policy requires in-person access to the defense equipment provided. Intelligence methods provide some accountability for observable platforms such as missiles and helicopters, but smaller items such as night vision devices have limited accountability," end quote. So, this is something I'm always worried about, that they could take these oversight concerns and kind of use it as a pretext to, get more involved in the war by sending more military personnel to Ukraine to conduct inspections of these weapons, which they actually did last year. I believe it was August 2022. The Pentagon announced that that there's military personnel in Ukraine conducting on-site inspections. Just a few dozen people, but still, it's an example, of mission creep, how the U.S. could be more involved. So Netanyahu was in and out of the hospital a few times, and he's out, and he's saying he's going to attend. The Knesset is scheduled to vote on this very controversial judicial overhaul on Monday. So this article is from Middle East Eye. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he would still attend a key judicial reform vote on Monday, despite having an unscheduled pacemaker implanted in him overnight Saturday. Netanyahu said that he was doing excellently after the operation and plans to jump right back into the work of overhauling Supreme Court powers that has brought nationwide protests to a boil and stirred calls for compromise. With the country ensnared in its worst domestic crisis in decades, President Isaac Herzog on Sunday met Netanyahu in the hospital in hope of closing the rifts between the religious nationalist ruling coalition and opposition parties. So Monday is going to be a big day in Israel. There's been huge protests, and all sorts of people, the military people, are very against this, and reservists saying that they won't serve if they pass this. So we'll see how the vote is. Netanyahu and his coalition seem pretty determined to push this thing through. All right, the next one here, the U.S. is sending Marines and warships to the Middle East over Iran tensions. So U.S. Central Command announced on July 20th that the U.S. was deploying a Marines Corps unit and additional warships to the Middle East amid heightened tensions with Iran. So the command said in a press release that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin ordered the deployment of an amphibious readiness group / Marine expeditionary unit, which typically consists of about 2,200 Marines and 3 amphibious warships. So it's pretty decent-sized force. And CENTCOM said that the deployment was ordered in response to recent attempts by Iran to seize commercial ships. So Iran seized 2 vessels in the Persian Gulf region after the U.S. seized a tanker carrying Iranian oil in the region in April. So it was the U.S. seizing that ship, forcing this tanker to go to the U.S. that really sparked this latest, whatever, if you want to call it a tanker war, whatever you want to call it. And since then, the U.S. has announced, it's conducting more patrols in the Persian Gulf and sending more military assets to the region. They just recently sent F-16s and other fighter jets, again, in the name of this protecting these ships from Iran. And they also sent a guided missile destroyer. So the U.S., I covered this last week, the Suez Rajan is the name of the U.S. Seized ship, the ship that the U.S. seized. I don't want you to think it's a U.S. ship, but right now it's still off the coast of Texas, and it's struggling to unload its cargo, which is Iranian oil, because American companies are fearful that if they take the oil, then Iran might retaliate in the Persian Gulf by seizing one of their tankers. So it's kind of an. Last one here is an article from NPR. The U.S. dismissed evidence of civilian deaths in Baghdadi raid. So this is the second time in recent weeks that we're running an article from NPR. It's definitely a rare occurrence, but so this is interesting. Confidential documents obtained by NPR provide new details about one of the most celebrated U.S. military operations in recent history and reveals flaws in the Pentagon's claim that deadly airstrikes did not hit civilians. So this was in 2019 that U.S. Special Operations Forces raided the Syrian hideout of ISIS founder Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, leading him to blow himself up. Then President Donald Trump called the raid impeccable, and military officials said that troops protected non-combatants. The Defense Department dismissed the accounts reported by NPR of U.S. helicopter fire killing and maiming Syrian civilians during the raid. The Pentagon said those men were enemy combatants who ignored warning shots. So NPR sued the Pentagon under the Freedom of Information Act to release documentation of the airstrike, and it obtained a redacted copy of the Defense Department's confidential 2020 report on the incident. The report was originally classified as secret with no foreign distribution. NPR's review of the document, including aerial imagery from the operation, finds that U.S. troops fired warning shots mere seconds before launching airstrikes on the Syrian men's van. This undermines the military's assertion that the men demonstrated hostility by failing to stop or change course. The Pentagon provided no evidence that the victims were enemy combatants, but beyond the split-second assessment by U.S. troops on the dark night of the raid, U.S. officials did not compile an intelligence dossier as recommended in the report. The Pentagon questioned the veracity of accounts given to NPR by the airstrike survivor and families of the victims, but it did not contact their survivor or conduct a full formal investigation. So it got these reports that they might have killed civilians, and they didn't do any kind of follow-up investigation, which is not surprising because the Pentagon, this is pretty typical of the Pentagon. And they also, the NPR spoke with the Syrian survivor. So it was one man that survived these airstrikes that was killed with two friends that he was with. So two of them were killed. One guy survived. He lost his arm. And he is saying that NPR, that is him and his two friends were working as agricultural laborers, and they were driving him home. And the Pentagon story is that they were militants unaffiliated with ISIS, which kind of doesn't make sense. Why would militants unaffiliated with ISIS try to engage with these U.S. troops if they think that they're raiding al-Baghdadi? And this guy's saying they didn't know that he was hiding out there. But it's just another case of how the Pentagon handles civilian casualties. They're not afraid to lie about it or just try to sweep it under the rug.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Look, there's this dynamic where, as somebody who's been a sharp critic of Donald Trump, it's remarkable, truly remarkable, how much his supporters will bend over backward to make excuses for him. And what's interesting about it is that it's not, look, it's one thing when if I argue with someone who is a liberal who thinks Fauci was great and all of the COVID, policies were wonderful, and I'm just denying the science, or whatever. That's kind of one thing. And of course you have a certain type of argument with that person. But there's something almost more frustrating about arguing with a Trump supporter who absolutely will acknowledge that all the COVID policies were terrible, that the vaccine was sold based off lies, that the lockdowns were horrific, all of these things. And then I'll go, but Trump's the guy who made Fauci the face of the pandemic response in 2020. Like, how do you defend that? And they agree with every one of our positions on that, but they'll still go, well, he was misled, or he had no choice but to do that. And you're like, yo, wait, what? Like, he was misled, and so he fell for it? That's his fault still, And so it's interesting to hear Trump at least kind of acknowledge this. Oh, yes, some of the people weren't that good.
This is exactly the way people without character behave. That you're on the campaign trail. I'll get it done in one day. No one's ever been more competent. Yeah. No one's better. Give me 1 week. Everything will be solved. I'm a winner. You'll win too. I'll get it done. Well, you didn't get anything done. What happened? Oh, I didn't know how to do the job, and so I hired bad people. That's called not having character.
Yeah,
when you're out there
that's
going,
the job. That's the job, dude. And look, he can say, and look, I will say, I find something about this kind of endearing because it's like I've never seen this out of Trump before. There's a real moment there where he goes, look, I'm from New York. I'd never been to Washington before. And I'm looking at Melania and I'm like, can you believe it? Can you believe we're in the White House now? Okay, I get that. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, dude, this is ultimately the problem with Donald Trump. The job was to have once read a book about something, to know something, dude, to know, how do you not know? How do you have this much bravado that I'm going to drain the swamp and still not know that fucking Bill Barr isn't the guy to do that? And you went, we're spending all this money over there. We have problems here. You couldn't just, if the response to that was, oh, so you're saying government spending programs at home work great? It's like, no, that doesn't follow at all. I'm just saying, don't spend the money over there. That doesn't mean I say the government should spend the money here. I'd like government to not spend the money at all. That's a perfectly reasonable position to take. So he gets this completely wrong. And And at the end of it, he says, you can be skeptical of Ukrainian military aid while being in favor of entitlement reform. You sure can. Me and Rob are both skeptical of Ukrainian military aid and pro-entitlement reform. He says, second off, the notion that America has no interest in Ukraine is untrue. We have an interest in the Russian military being defanged so they do not invade surrounding nations, thus threatening global supply chains and strengthening American opponents. We have an interest in deterring China from invading Taiwan.
Oh, my God. Let me at him. Let me at him, Dave.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Rob.
my God. The fucking left. Firstly, you're ignoring just countless deaths. But fine. Let's just go with strategic interests. We don't care. You and I, we don't care about human lives. Kill as many as Ukrainians as you want if it's in the American interest. Let's just imagine that scenario for a second. All right, so you're securing supply lines? What the fuck are you talking about? You just took out a pipeline that had trade between Russia. They're talking about all these breadbasket issues of people not being able to get enough food. And guess what? If we weren't all tied down in this Russia thing, you might have a better chance at actually opposing the Taiwan thing.
Yeah, I mean, look, what has been worse for supply chains than America picking a side in this war? It's just like, it's just bonkers, man. It's like anyone can they can always come up with these rationalizations. Like, I'll have people still to this day.
But the point is, and not caring about death, completely ignoring the fact that you've destroyed a country and you're losing a ton of life and pretending like these strategic interests are actually worth that cost. And even if they were, which I don't think they are, and you'd be really evil to take that perspective, one, you got no proof that Russia was invading any other countries. You got no proof of that whatsoever. And two, everything you just labeled as a strategic concern, you actually have a bigger problem with now.
It's so eclipsed by where you are on this war in Ukraine. It's just way more important as president. And this to me, he's just completely disqualified. Completely disqualified. If you can't come out against this insane policy and you have to do whatever the hell it is that he just did, whatever that is, just say nothing and ramble about how you're going to be more hawkish on these other countries that also, by the way, pose no threat to us. Oh, Iran. Yeah. You know what the answer to the crisis in Ukraine is? We should bomb Iran. That's the answer. This is just too insane to me. And I think from what I've seen of where the Republican base is at, certainly where that audience at the Blaze event that Tucker Carlson was hosting, where they're at, I think this is not going to be good enough for them either. I think DeSantis is toast. There's two options here. There's two possibilities here, I should say. Either he actually opposes this war, but doesn't have the balls to say it because it might offend his donor class, or he actually supports the war, but doesn't have the balls to say that he completely supports it because that'll offend his voting bloc. Either one, to me, disqualifies him. If he actually opposes this war, but doesn't have the balls to say it to offend his donors, then how can I count on you when you actually get in there to do the things that are going to offend all of these powerful people? And if you support the war and are just trying to win votes, then you're disqualified to me as well. This is the most important issue, and he is failing it. So I'm done. I'm done with DeSantis. I'm interested in the campaigns that RFK is running. I'm interested because you can't not be. It's just too entertaining. In Donald Trump. I'm interested in Vivek Ramaswamy. I'll get it right eventually. I'm interested in who the Libertarian Party is going to put up as their candidate. I'm interested in Cornel West. I find all of these guys interesting.
And I don't think most of NATO. I know the Germans don't want to go to war. I think other folks in the Union don't want to go to war. I think that would be by the way, I think that would shatter NATO. If they did that, NATO would basically say, I can no longer support being a member. I no longer support Article 5, which ends the alliance. So I think people understood the moment you say yes to Ukraine, you say no to NATO. And I don't know. I'm just saying, I'm not sure if that's a bad idea at this point, but that's what the reality would be.
Right. Here's Secretary of Defense Austin. So this is 10 days ago, right after Vilnius being asked point blank.
Yeah.
Should Ukraine join NATO?
So you have no doubt that after the war, Ukraine will become a member of NATO?
I have no doubt that will happen. And we heard just about all the countries in the room say as much. And I think that was reassuring to President Zelensky.
He didn't sound very credible to me. But what would Russia do if Ukraine became a member of NATO? I mean, this is like declaring World War III.
It is. And I think that's the issue. The Budapest Accord, I believe, is the name of it, from 94, when the separation of Ukraine and Russia was finalized, creating Ukrainian independence. The agreement was no nukes in Ukraine, nukes go back to Russia. And then on our side, British included, no eastward expansion of NATO. So those agreements have long since been broken. And I for one, have always said, you need to recognize, even if you don't agree with it, the fact that the Russians have legitimate issues, traditions, and cultural concerns that go back generations. So the moment you start, it's like I was talking to one of my colleagues who was a very staunch conservative yesterday about this. And it's like, well, we would never accept Mexico becoming a Soviet satellite. Probably not. Probably that would have been a bridge too far, and we would have not stood for Mexico becoming essentially an organization that a country that responded to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. I don't know why people think it's different with them. The Russians have a lot of issues that go back generations. So I think ignoring those issues, Judge, is part of what's brought us to this point in time. And the moment you put another nation, NATO nation, on the border of Russia, I think Russia is going to look at how it can become more aggressive in pushing things back. They have an inherent paranoia. I'm not here to support it. I'm just telling you they have an inherent paranoia that's going to result in a global war if you continue to push them.
Isn't there paranoia rational when Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush said NATO won't move 1 inch eastward, and it's now 800 miles eastward? And you're right. Think of how we would react if Mexico became a satellite of Russia or of China, and they had missiles and they're aimed at Dallas and Miami. How would we react?
I'm completely with you. And it's like our side, this cultural projection. It's like, oh, well, we're the good guys. No, I don't trust our good guys. I've seen the good guys from the inside. No, they ain't so good. So I think we need to recognize that left to Western devices, Victoria Nuland, Tony Blinken, and Biden, because I think he doesn't have any ability to discern or push back, would actually push for a war.
The issue of whether or not this is going to keep Putin from continuing to fight, the answer is Putin's already lost the war. Putin has a real problem. How does he move from here? What does he do? And so the idea that there's going to be what vehicle is used, he can end the war tomorrow. He could just say, I'm out. But what agreement is ultimately reached depends upon Putin and what he decides to do. But there is no possibility of him winning the war in Ukraine. He's already lost that war. Imagine if he's already lost that war.
An embarrassment at an international function that was in Helsinki 10 days ago. But can he possibly believe or even understand what he's saying, Tony?
So, I think I'm one of those who've been calling for his impeachment for a long time. I think it's long overdue. The simple fact that he would say something that's so completely detached from reality is of grave concern. Anybody who studies the war for any length of time understands the dynamics, and Putin is not in any jeopardy, either domestically. I think the whole Prigozhin thing was designed in some ways. Maybe he was aware that was going to happen and was able to use that, as Stalin did, to kind of purge people who were disloyal. I mean, as I've said before, Judge, you can take the man out of the Soviet. You can't take the Soviet out of the man. And I think they're still using Soviet tactics to govern. So I think that's one aspect. Second aspect is the numbers. The Russian economy is on wartime footing. They are outproducing the West, the whole West, by about 10-1 across the board. And plus, they have found alternate sources of high-tech gadgetry. Iran, China, they're in no danger, and they've worked around the sanctions. So I just don't see how Biden has any ability, if he's any copacetic at all. Compos mentis. What is that term? Is it Latin? He's like he's non-compos mentis.
Right.
He is not, and because that's
in control of his own brain.
Yeah. So someone told him to say that, and it's Victoria Nuland and Tony Blinken, which I think they are criminally, liable for the stupidity which he's exhibiting. Judge, do you remember during World War II, D-Day, when Eisenhower first sent in the artillery and put them on the beach, and then he waited about 2 days, and then he sent in the troops, and then after that they sent in the B-17s to bomb the rear area, and then after that they really allowed them to have jeeps for the men to kind of run around. Remember how this was laid out over 6 months? They did the Normandy invasion over 6 months. I'm being completely a smartass here. That's my point.
Right.
Eisenhower hit them with everything we had on June 6, 1944, an overwhelming use of military force, the biggest armada, the biggest air assault ever to that date, everything at once. It was a strategy based on the knowledge of how the Germans processed information and then knowing where their weaknesses were. That's war. What John Kirby is laying out is the same basic format of throwing money at something and hoping for the best that screwed up our education system across the board. Just throwing money at it, no strategy.
So how much longer does this last, Tony?
Well, it can't last indefinitely. I think, look, it's gone past my prediction. I thought we'd be done at least into talks by now. I thought June would have gotten us to talks based on what I thought would have been rational people in the room. I think it's going to go another 3 months at the current kind of issue. The next big issue, I think, is going to be the fall rains. The rains are going to have an effect on the battle space. I don't think either side's going to want that. I think the Ukrainians, because they are not doing well, just a little note. I mean, they publicly acknowledged 20% loss of Bradleys. I think it's closer to 30. Every Bradley maintainer on the planet is heading to Poland to help recover these things. We're sending more stuff. I think they're going to do this piecemeal Battle of Kursk nonsense probably till October, unfortunately.
And right now, it was announced just a month ago or so that the Ukrainians are under pressure from us. We had to go in there and have a counter-offensive against the success of the Russians.
Yeah.
So they were all set to do this, but then it wasn't doing so well, and then it's back and forth. But our government keeps pushing them anyway, even though we argued at the time that it was foolish to start it, it was ridiculous. And it turns out that they knew about how bad it was. And the Wall Street Journal had an article out and said, the officials knew that it was a no-win situation, and it's bad, but give us more money. So they keep doing that. Even today, they have, even though now the article came out with information that a good person in the military could understand and probably predict this from early on, and that is what is happening. It was totally unsuccessful, and now they're admitting we knew it all along. Of course, they're not saying it that way, but that's what the Wall Street Journal, who was very, very hawkish, admitted. They weren't ready for this. Why in thunder are we doing this for?
Yeah, and the people who warned that this would be the outcome were completely ignored. I mean, we've talked about people like Colonel McGregor and Larry Johnson and others, Scott Ritter, they've all spoken at our conferences. They were saying this all along, and they were just dismissed as, just pro-Russian defeatists. But now we have the Wall Street Journal starting to spill the beans a little bit. Put on that first clip if you can. This is the article, and everyone's talking about this article because it's rare when the mainstream media tells some truth, and when it does, it's shocking. The article is titled, "Ukraine's Lack of Weaponry and Training Risks Stalemate in Fight with Russia." And go to the next one. Here is the operative phrase. When Ukraine launched its big counteroffensive this spring, Western military officials knew Kiev didn't have all the training or weapons, from shells to warplanes, that it needed to dislodge Russian forces. But they hoped Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would carry the day. It's an astonishing sentence, Dr. Paul, because they knew they didn't have what it takes to do what they said they were going to do, which is take back parts of Ukraine that Russia had occupied. They knew they couldn't do it, so their strategy was simply to hope that they did it. I mean, I've never seen such cynicism on display before, is that it's like, oh yeah, well of course we knew all along that they weren't going to be able to do this. After 5 weeks of grueling battles, they estimate over 25,000 men have died in these 5 weeks in this counteroffensive. And when it hasn't gone anywhere, they haven't even reached the first fortified lines in southern Ukraine, first of at least 3 or 4, depending on what part of that area there are. They haven't even reached the first lines, and they've been slaughtered. And so what do? Someone from the administration leaks to the Wall Street Journal, oh, well, we knew all along that they weren't going to do it anyway. We just kind of hoped that they would. So it's really the height of cynicism. But at the same time, you could also talk about how this is what happens when you believe your own propaganda. I mean, it's a circular reasoning. When people like McGregor and Ritter and those are saying, look, based on our experience, this is what's going to happen. This is not what you're saying. They just refuse to listen, like they did with COVID and other things, and something we're going to talk about later today. They just refuse to listen and refuse to consider any outside voices that would interfere with the narrative that they had, constructed. It's like the old thing that was from the Bush administration. We create our own reality, and that's what they do. And so, unfortunately, for Ukrainian men who are now fewer and further between, thousands and thousands have died because Washington hoped that they would do better.
That effort, and they draw these lines, and it has to be in many ways deliberate, because it's not an all-out war, fortunately, but it's an all-out effort to undermine a system of governments around the world and threaten a real war breaking out. I mean, a real war, about a big war. I'm talking about all of Europe and all of Asia get involved in this. I think the money will run out before then. I don't think that's going to happen here in the near future, but I think the strategy of limited war and having lines drawn, and as long as we don't have our pilots flying those airplanes, that'll be okay, because maybe the Russians would shoot some of them down, then that could be embarrassing. So the lines are artificially drawn for a war that is artificial.
Well, I'd hate to be Zelensky, because all he needs to do is look through a little bit of history and look what happens to the people who were the favorites: Noriega, Gaddafi, Saddam, Milosevic. It's not a good position, and they're going to start looking for someone to blame, and he's going to have to go to one of his hundreds of homes that he owns. Well, let's move on, because this is an interesting one. This is something we've talked about for a long time, which is silencing scientists whose views are not accepted by the mainstream. And this is from the Daily Skeptic. Cancellations start for John Clauser after Nobel Physics laureate speaks out about the corruption of climate science. An extremely distinguished physicist, wins a Nobel Prize, starts talking about things like climate change in a way that the elites don't want, and he's canceled.
Right, and the one motivation that they have to have is fear, scare the people, you know, whether it's a virus or somebody's going to invade us or whatever it is. They have to scare and build up the fear. And they generally get away with this until somebody wakes up. But this mess that we have now, these people that are citing all these statistics, the hottest day in the world history. And, you know, people have already dissected that, and that's what this article is about. And this is why John Clauser, has been revealing what he really believes. And isn't it amazing? When they were looking at him as a scientist, they give him the Nobel Prize. Yeah. You know, but they turn on him. Oh, he said something we don't agree with. He told the truth. Doesn't he know what these rules are? So that to me is such a tragedy. And I don't have any fear. I don't lie awake at night thinking, will the truth ever be known? No, the truth will be known. But tragically, there's going to be a lot of suffering in the meantime. And this whole thing about, just think, the whole effort of lockdown on COVID probably did a lot more harm than good. But you would have ended up with more scientific evidence of what we should do and who should get shots and this sort of thing if it had been sorted out medically and scientifically rather than politically. And that's where the real problem is.
Ladies and gentlemen, how much more fun are we going to have than those poor souls stuck at that snore fest down the street? Now, we can't promise you the deep thoughts of Joe Lieberman or Rudy Giuliani. But you'll enjoy yourselves all the same, I'm confident. My friends, it's been said that Americans are faced with a choice between the stupid party and the evil party. And that once in a while, the two parties get together and they do something that's both stupid and evil. And this is called bipartisanship. If anything, though, that's too optimistic, because in so many ways that matter, we may as well have a one-party system. Some people on the left are finally discovering, to their chagrin, that the so-called change Barack Obama would make to foreign policy is just cosmetic. And what did they expect? Look at his foreign policy panel. Look who's on it. Madeleine Albright, the former Secretary of State, and liberals and leftists, listen up. This woman, when she was on 60 Minutes, and she was asked, what about the 500,000 children that the sanctions on Iraq have killed? She said, we believe the price has been worth it. So that's the change candidate. Well, how very refreshing. On taxes, the Democrat favors a top income tax rate of 39.5%, and the Republican favors a top rate of 35%. Well, ain't democracy grand? We get to debate a whole 4.5 percentage points. We better spread this system all over the world. Now forget about spending. The Democrat spends his time thinking about ways to throw away money we don't have. The Republican, who knows how many additional billions his foreign policy bellicosity is going to saddle us with, but he pledges to balance the budget without a tax increase by 2013, while also strengthening the dollar and closing the $70 trillion entitlement shortfall. And we're supposed to believe this. Been there, done that. And by the way, if you'll forgive me for stating the obvious, you are not a fiscal conservative, or any other kind of conservative for that matter, if you think it's A-OK to stay in Iraq for 100 years.
Woke culture has become so prominent in the American education system that it would not be surprising to learn that schools were replacing the once popular rhyme, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me," with "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but opinions I disagree with can make me feel unsafe, so they must be silenced." Take the case of a 12-year-old Liam Morrison, a student at Nichols Middle School in Middlesbrough, Massachusetts. This March, Liam was told to change his shirt or be sent home. School staff are reported to have said his shirt targeted a protected class. Liam says he was told his shirt was making some students feel unsafe. Did Liam's shirt advocate violence? No. The Liam's shirt simply stated that there were only two genders. A free society cannot exist where a substantial portion of its population demands and receives protection from exposure to opposing ideas. If the history of authoritarianism teaches us anything, it is that those in positions of power are often willing to provide a frightened people with security as long as the people are willing to sacrifice their and their fellow citizens' liberty. Fighting the woke agenda is therefore not, as some libertarians claim, a culture war distraction from the pursuit of liberty. Instead, fighting the woke agenda is crucial to restoring a free society. Of course, this means working to roll back government power by, for example, shutting down the unconstitutional Department of Education and getting Congress to pass legislation forbidding government officials from telling social media companies to censor certain American citizens. We must also resist joining those misguided conservatives who are calling on the right to seek to use government power to impose a right-wing version of wokeness on the American people. The backlash against wokeness in schools is leading more parents to either become involved in their local school boards or to look for alternatives such as homeschooling. Parents who are interested in a homeschooling program that provides children with a well-rounded education that will help their child awake but not become woke should consider my homeschool curriculum. The Ron Paul curriculum provides students with a well-rounded education that includes rigorous programs in history, mathematics, and the physical and natural sciences. The curriculum also provides instruction in personal finance. Students can develop superior written and oral communication skills via intensive writing and public speaking courses. Another feature of my curriculum is that it provides students the opportunity to create and run their own internet businesses. The government and history sections of the curriculum emphasize Austrian economics, libertarian political theory, and the history of liberty. However, unlike government schools, my curriculum never puts ideological indoctrination ahead of education. Interactive forums allow students to engage with and learn from each other. The forums ensure students are actively engaged in their education as well as give them an opportunity to interact with their peers outside of a formal setting. I encourage all parents looking for alternatives to government schools, alternatives that would provide children with a well-rounded education that will allow them to learn about the history and ideas of liberty instead of pushing on them wokeness and the lies of the cultural Marxists. To go to ronpaulcurriculum.com for more information about my homeschooling program.
Ukraine says that drone attacks on Moscow will increase. So after 2 drones targeted Moscow early Monday, a Ukrainian military intelligence spokesman warned that such attacks on the Russian capital city will continue and increase in scale in a rare Ukrainian admission of responsibility for attacks inside Russia. So this is spokesman Andriy Yusov. He said this to the Kiev Post, quote, "The strikes on the key facilities of Russia's security sector located in Moscow testify to the fact that the Putin regime is unable to fully control the sky even for the protection of most important facilities. Obviously, this situation will continue and increase in scale," end quote. So Russian authorities said that the drones were downed with electronic warfare jamming systems, but one of them struck a business center in Moscow, shattering the high-rise building's windows. Moscow's mayor said that there were no casualties in the attack. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova called the drone attack an act of international terrorism. So there's also a larger Ukrainian drone attack that was launched in Crimea early Monday, with the Russian Defense Ministry saying that 17 Ukrainian drones were down, so quite a few drones were launched at Crimea. The head of Crimea said that an ammunition depot on the peninsula was hit and a private residence was damaged. So the Biden administration maintains that it does not enable Ukrainian attacks inside Russia, but that restriction does not apply to Crimea, as Washington and Kiev do not recognize the peninsula as Russian territory. The operations, of course, risk a major escalation, especially if Russia believes that the US and NATO are backing these attacks. Russia has previously said that Ukrainian attacks on Moscow are not possible without US support, so that's Russia's view. And the New York Times reported last month that the Biden administration is no longer concerned that Ukrainian attacks inside Crimea or inside Russia might escalate the war. So the damage Israel is causing to its support base in the United States is becoming more apparent. A very bright warning flare went up this weekend, appearing once again in the New York Times. This time it was columnist Nicholas Kristof, who took a much bolder and far less speculative step than his colleague Tom Friedman did last week by suggesting that the very heart of AIPAC's mission, annual military aid to Israel, should be phased out. So Friedman, this is even a big deal that Thomas Friedman, if you're familiar with him, huge Zionist, supporter of Israel, liberal, big New York Times columnist, floated the idea of a reassessment of the United States' relationship with Israel. I think that's a bigger deal than Biden saying it. He said that it might be on the horizon. And, that's a big deal, but what was published on Saturday was a bigger deal. Kristof published this and quoted two former U.S. ambassadors to Israel saying that the U.S. should not give military aid to Israel anymore. And as Politnik says, it's a liberal Zionist argument for ending military aid to Israel. So Kristof's column strikes at the very heart of the lobbying might of pro-Israel forces and used noted liberal Zionists to do it. Former ambassadors to Israel Dan Kurtzer and Martin Idyk, probably pronouncing that wrong, and they're saying why they think it's a good idea to stop sending billions of dollars in military aid to Israel each year. So Israel gets $3.8 billion each year. And what they're saying is that this doesn't give the U.S., really much influence on Israel's policies. And this is really over the fact that, this judicial overhaul thing is going on. That's what has really upset these liberals. They really don't like the right-wing Netanyahu government that has these extremist settlers and ultra-Orthodox people in the coalition. So they had their big vote on Monday, and despite these huge protests, the Israeli parliament passed this new law. So this article is from Middle East Eye. Israel was hit by a political earthquake on Monday as MPs passed a law limiting the Supreme Court's power, one of a raft of judicial reforms critics say are turning the country into an autocracy. Ahead of the vote and after, thousands of protesters in Jerusalem blocked the roads leading to Israel's parliament, the Knesset, with police using water cannons to remove them. Thousands more gathered in Tel Aviv, with protests expected throughout the night. So MPs passed the bill by 64 votes to 0 after opposition lawmakers left the parliament in protest when compromise talks broke down. So this new law abolishes Israel's reasonableness standard, eliminating the Supreme Court's ability to block government decisions that it deems unreasonable. It's part of a package of bills proposed by the government earlier this year, which is seeking to overhaul the judicial system in the country. Proponents of the plan say it's necessary to restore the balance of power between government branches, while opponents say it will remove checks and balances and undermines the independence of the judicial system. So on Sunday, the deputy chief of the Russian Center for Reconciliation of the opposing parties in Syria reported the incident with the drone. He said, quote, "Of special concern is a near mid-air collision of a coalition's MQ-9 unmanned aerial vehicle with Russian warplanes near Al-Bab. Russian pilots once again demonstrated high professionalism and took timely measures to prevent collisions with the coalition's unmanned aerial vehicles," end quote. So he went on to say that the drones are activating their fire guidance systems on Russian planes, which automatically triggers the fighter jet's onboard defense systems. So this is definitely concerning that there's all these encounters. It's kind of an area most people wouldn't expect as a flashpoint for a war between the U.S. and Russia. Everybody would expect that to happen in Ukraine or the Black Sea or something. But I mean, this could, again, another area that could easily spiral out of control. And that was always the risk of the U.S. continuing this occupation of Syria. You got Russia there, you got Iran there, just a lot of tripwires for war. Spanish newspaper reports that the CIA spied on Ecuador's former president. So this article is from Consortium News. And this is interesting. Spanish private security company UC Global allegedly spied for the United States Central Intelligence Agency on meetings held between former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa and leaders of several Latin American countries in 2018. El País has reported, that's the Spanish newspaper. So according to the paper, the security company spied in particular on Correa's meetings with Argentina's former president, Brazil's former president, and Uruguay's former president. And this information emerged from an examination of the MacBook laptop belonging to David Morales. former military officer and owner of UC Global. So this is the guy who was spying on Julian Assange, the owner of this private security company. And it's pretty clear now that he was doing so at the behest of the CIA. And this was when Assange was in the Ecuadorian embassy. And it was the president at the time, Rafael Correa, who gave him, what do you call? Sorry, I'm blanking on the word here, but he let Assange stay in the embassy. And it looks like the CIA was also spying on him. So this is a big deal because when it comes to the case against Julian Assange, if the CIA, if the U.S. government was spying on Assange and, recording his meetings with lawyers and advocates and everything, I mean, the case against him should be thrown out, you would think. So this evidence should be enough to get it dismissed and get Assange out of jail. But unfortunately, that's not the case. He's still awaiting, I guess, the appeal of the extradition decision from the UK. But this, should be very important to that case. So hopefully, more and more revelations about this guy, David Morales, and his company leads to the courts in the UK deciding that, there's been too much, U.S. spying on him to extradite him. But, unfortunately, I don't expect the British to make the right decision on this.
Weaknesses have been exposed by Prigozhin's mutiny, but I think even more deeply than that, they've been exposed by Putin's misjudgment since he launched this invasion as well. And I think there's a relationship between the battleground in Ukraine and what's going on inside Russia, in the sense that if and when the Ukrainians make further advances on the battlefield, I think what that's going to do is cause more and more Russians in the elite and outside the elite to pay attention to Prigozhin's critique of the war. Putin is someone who generally thinks that revenge is a dish best served cold, so he's going to try to settle the situation to the extent he can. But again, in my experience, Putin is the ultimate apostle of payback, so I would be surprised if Prigozhin escapes further retribution for this. So in that sense, the president's right. If I were Prigozhin, I wouldn't fire my food taster.
Why should the chief spy be making statements like that in front of an audience that he knows will receive them well?
He shouldn't. It sort of is the epitome of his having become a propagandist. And that's exactly what a director of the CIA.
That is so, I know you're going to agree with me, Ray. That is so dangerous for the head of the CIA and thus the people that work for him to become propagandists. That assures, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that the president will only hear the intel that the people telling him think he wants to hear.
Well, that's correct. And it's also correct at the military. I mean, you have a Secretary of Defense now, Austin, who, when head of CENTCOM in Tampa, the command that's responsible for activities in the Middle East, 51 of his intelligence analysts, I think maybe it was 52, okay, formally complained to the Pentagon Inspector General that Austin and his chief lieutenants, his generals up there, were falsifying the intelligence that the young people were sending up. Syria was a wreck. It was not going to be a win for the West, so to speak, and a loss for Assad. So he's got a record of this. If he knows what the president wants to hear, he's going to tell him that Burns might be a guy like that. Let me add just one thing so people know about Burns. I used to respect him. I've met him when he was ambassador to Russia, February 2008. Here's just two sentences out of a cable he wrote back to Washington. Now Bush and Cheney were in charge. Quote, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years, conversations with Russian key players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have found no one who views Ukraine in anything as anything other than a direct challenge, direct provocation to Russian interests. Now, why do I say that? End quote. Okay. Well, now, 15 years later, what's Bill Burns saying? Unprovoked, no provocation. Putin drove his armies into Ukraine without provocation. He's a bad, bad, bad guy. And I know because I'm the head of CIA. Give me a break. Can you forget stuff like that in 15 years? I don't think so. He's a propagandist, and he's telling the president what the president wants to hear. And so he gets promoted to the cabinet on those merits. God help us all.
Who did what to whom?
Well, Judge, before the little interruption there, you talked about how do you explain the Russians shooting down the grain deal? And you yourself have corrected yourself in the past. The Russians didn't shoot down the grain deal. They renewed it for a couple of months, several times. What happened? Well, the West didn't live up to the terms of the grain deal. Part of that was to relieve some sanctions on what the Russians were able to do with their shipping, and that didn't happen. So, long story short, the Russians were diddled again. Now, there's more to it than that. Odessa is being bombed to smithereens, one of the main ports exporting these grain deals. What's the West going to do? Now, Zelensky wants the Turks to escort, break the blockade. The Turks said, "I thank you very much. We don't want to get involved with Russia that way." Is the West going to help Zelensky try to defy these new regulations in the Black Sea? I don't know, but it's very, very volatile there because there are ships and there are people taking pot shots at bridges, and all manner of things that can happen in the Black Sea to no one's good.
So what becomes of the grain now? This is Ukrainian grain, is it not? Or grain grown and harvested in Ukraine?
Yeah, I guess the Russians have reserved the right to inspect all ships going into Ukrainian ports, and that takes a while. Sometimes they find stuff. There's some recent reports about gunpowder or some sort of explosive powder on one of those ships. So it's going to delay things. The Russians have their own way of exporting grain. They have a bumper crop. So it's something of a fiction to say that the people who really need it and the people who the Russians ship to will be deprived of what they need to eat. It's complicated, but the main thing is that in the Black Sea and up toward Belarus and Poland, there are fires brewing. There are demonstrative gestures to say this far, but no farther, according to Putin. And I just learned this morning, Shoigu, the defense minister, is off to North Korea for consultations. Whoa!
Wait a minute. Why would the Russian defense minister be in North Korea? What could the North Koreans possibly supply to the Russians?
Well, they don't need supplies from North Korea. What they need to do is just round up all the likely suspects. Okay, get all the people who are allies of Russia and China in this confrontation, line them all up and say, look, we don't know what the U.S. is going to do. I, Vladimir Putin, have called these people crazy for perpetrating or risking a two-front war against not only us, but China, and you guys are also involved. It could be. So look, let's make it very clear that if NATO, if the collective West does something really egregious, that they do face a two-front war, and that might mean they would have to do some exercises that are even more provocative than the ones you've done heretofore.
Well, getting back to the American propagandist in chief, here's the president in Helsinki right after the conference in Vilnius 2 weeks ago, trying to do his best to make a simple declaratory statement that Russia, in his view, has lost the war.
There's no possibility of him winning the war in Ukraine. He's already lost that war. Imagine anyway, he's already lost that war.
Now, do you think, I know you're not a shrink, he honestly believes that? He honestly believes that? Or Bill Burns and company have given him such propaganda that it seems credible?
Well, they're not mutually exclusive, of course.
Correct.
I think the latter is quite true. It doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what Putin believes. He's already called these people crazy. What is he to think about his opposite number with his fingers on the codes for nuclear weapons in this kind of shape? I regret to say that were I Putin, I would prepare for the worst and I would have my retaliatory forces on trigger alert. I mean, what would these crazy people advise Biden to do next, and how close would he be to say, well, that makes sense, and he'd mumble through what the justification in quotes would be for the American people? This is really strange. It's really very dangerous, and as I say, it all depends on how not only Putin but his military look at these things. And the military, of course, looks at capabilities, not intentions. So if the capability of the U.S. is to notch up the escalation, to send F-16s, which even the U.S. is now backtracking on, that would be a nuclear capable aircraft to be shot down by superior Russian aircraft. I hold no brief for Russian superiority, but it's there, folks. It's there not only in the conventional sense, it's there in a strategic sense for the first time since the Cold War began. Mark my words, they have hypersonic capabilities we do not have. And if the balloon goes up, God help us, they're not in a position to sit back and say, well, okay, we'll just take it.
He admitted that's why we sent them as a bridge till the artillery shells arrive, the cluster bombs.
Yeah, Judge, the point is this. Why don't we have basic ammunition for artillery? The reason is that the Soviet Union fell apart 32 years ago. It was no threat. You couldn't persuade the Germans even to build new tanks because there's no threat from Russia. What happened? In 2014, we did a coup on Russia's periphery. We had been warned Ukraine should not be part of NATO. The new coup leaders we put in said, let's become part of NATO. That's when it started, the 22nd of February 2014, not the 23rd, not a month later, when their main naval base in Sevastopol in Crimea was annexed to Russia. So if you don't know that, how many years, 14 to, well, that's 9 years ago. That's when it all started.
But now the big issue is should the Republicans now impeach Biden? And there's a couple positions you could take there. The first thing is, I don't think it should be hard for anybody that is outside the inner circle of Biden that ought to be investigated, find out. The stories coming out now, and the Republicans who are arguing now that there's been a tremendous benefit by the Republicans, even with a narrow margin. Maybe narrow margins are a good way to handle things. Yeah. Getting control of the Congress and looking into this. So the evidence now and the hearings, I think in many ways this past weekend was a big deal, but it continues to get big, and there's more talk of having an impeachment. I'm sort of reserved on impeachment. I don't think impeachment. They say they wouldn't have to do a whole lot more. We have the evidence. Next week, let's vote on impeachment. I think that that's not going to work, because one thing for sure is impeachment has been grossly distorted compared to 1974. 1974, just the thought of a possible impeachment. It's just the thought that the evidence may lead to that. It's just the thought that Republicans were agreeing with Democrats. Big difference, and they were much more civil. But now if there seems like there's plenty of justification for a real investigation, so why doesn't the DOJ do that? Well, who believes in the DOJ? And I mean, the people that need investigators are the FBI right now. You know, this whole thing. So it's not easily done. And an inquiry, looking into and getting more evidence, whether it's done in 6 days or 6 weeks or whatever, I think long term, it's the truth that we want.
Cool, because we both read this from the Federalist, and it's an interesting article by Margot Cleveland. She's our chief legal reporter. The title is "Only an Impeachment Inquiry Can Unravel Biden Family Corruption and the Fed's Role." And I think she's making the case that you're making, because I think what you're saying, Dr. Paul, is boom, boom, impeachment and done is really not going to do the job, because what we need to know is we need to find out exactly what was going on in a nonpartisan way. That's not what we got with Trump. As you say, it was totally 100% partisan. Ironically, some of the things he was accused of, it looks like Biden may have actually done. You remember when Hillary's server information came out, and she's having all these emails in her bathroom, highly confidential. Remember what Bernie Sanders did? He didn't say, hey, let's get her, this is bad. He said, I don't care about Hillary's emails. He basically gave up on that. Well, RFK Jr. did not do that yesterday. He said, we need to investigate the Bidens and find out what's going on. That's a big change. It says a lot about his character, but also says a lot about the realities in the Democratic Party right now. And the other thing, Dr. Paul, I would say the other shoe to drop is Devon Archer. And this was Hunter's business partner. They were involved with Burisma Energy in Ukraine, his oligarch company that was paying the brilliant Hunter Biden, great painter, humanitarian. They're paying him $80,000 a month because he was so brilliant. The partner is now facing serious jail time for some of the other stuff that he's done. So it sounds like he's going to go and testify before Congress to give some information and try to keep himself out of boiling water. I would hate to be him right now because it might be dangerous, but I think that really is the other shoe to drop, because, we had, was it Bobulinski his name was, and he got a little bit of info, but everyone knows Devon Archer. Everyone knows he was the main partner. So if he comes out with some serious information and he's suggesting, he's teasing that he has some big stuff, it could be really bad, because this is what's going to happen here in a few days, and it's going to be big. Because you remember what President Biden said. I never spoke to anyone that dealt with my son in business. I had nothing to do with his business whatsoever. He's just relying on his inner brilliance. Well, doesn't look to be the case. Here's Miranda Devine's piece in the Post. Hunter Biden put then VP dad Joe on the phone with business associates at least 24 times, ex-partner Devon Archer to testify. He would repeatedly get his dad on the horn, put him on speakerphone. Obviously, his dad is the vice president of the United States. That is a little bit more than just Joe Blow. Put the next one up, because this is the detail from Miranda's piece. Hunter Biden would dial in his father, then VP Biden, on speakerphone into meetings with his overseas business partners, according to testimony expected this week from Devon Archer. Archer, as we mentioned, is facing jail for his role in a $60 million bond fraud. He's scheduled to testify to the House Oversight Committee. He's trying to keep his bacon out of jail, which one would understand, no question about it. But the main thing, and I'm just going to paraphrase it, about the Burisma thing that's so important is that, this company was being investigated by their prosecutor, their chief prosecutor in Ukraine, and the interference was made after some bribes were paid. These are the allegations. Some bribes were paid by the owner of this company, by the head of this company, a fellow called Zlochevsky. $10 million is the claim, and Senator Grassley released this information. Here's $10 million. You got to get rid of this guy. He's looking into our corruption. We don't like this at all. And so not only did Biden make sure the guy was gotten rid of, He actually bragged about it in this famous clip that we should show. It's a minute long if we can put it on. Now, there is one bad word in there, but that's typical of Biden. But if put that first clip on in here where he's so dumb that he admits that he committed something that's way worse than anything Trump has done. You might want to put your earplug in here, Dr. Paul, and listen to what he's having to say.
I'll give you one concrete example. But it just happened to be, that was the assignment I got. I got all the good ones. So I got Ukraine. And I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there's another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they walked out to press conference. I said, we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting $1 billion. I said, you're not getting $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. I think it was, 6 hours? I said, leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
Two funny things about this. First of all, I think that laughter among the other two was kind of nervous laughter, because this is a case where he's admitting to a crime. Like, what? Should be quiet. He's literally saying, if you don't call the dogs off of this company that my son's working for, you don't get $1 billion. And here he is just admitting it.
It's almost like he self-indictment.
Yeah.
That should be all that's necessary.
Yeah, so there's 24 times he called his dad, hey, get on the phone, Dad. I got to get this deal going. So it doesn't look good for him, and will remain it'll remain to be seen. Like you say, will some Dems get on board and say, look, this guy is a disaster for us? Well, I think here's the other thing we were going to talk about if we put the next one on. So even Kevin McCarthy, who's despite how he would like to style himself, is really not a radical bomb thrower by any stretch of the imagination. Even he is saying, he's comparing Biden to Nixon and saying a congressional probe will rise to impeachment inquiry. And if you go to the next one, he actually is telling the truth here. And here's what he says. We would know none of this if Republicans hadn't taken the majority, he said. Congressional Republicans have been probing Biden since they took over the House in January. McCarthy said amplifying the probe of Biden to an impeachment inquiry would give Congress the strongest power to get the rest of the knowledge and information needed. And I think to that, not to put words in your mouth, he would say yes, but be cautioned. Use caution.
When I think about this in the big picture of money being stolen and corruption and money under the table, and then you compare it to what we have made legal. Just think of all the illegalities that go on in the redistribution of wealth, how they can take it and move it from one group to another group because another group either wants it or demands it, or they have a political clout to do it. And a lot of people refer to that, and I do too, as it's plunder. And yet that is okay because it was done by a Democratic Congress. They voted for this. And this is the one reason why this dictatorship of the majority doesn't work. But they have done that for years. But that is where the big thing is. And if we looked at the current events right now, the current event, or what the military-industrial complex has done, the pharmaceutical industry, the social media, what they've accomplished, and the collusion with government, these are big things. And so much of it they consider perfectly illegal, especially the transfer of wealth. I think people are starting to feel it and understood it, and it never seemed to hurt me when I was campaigning, is that poor people suffer because there's a monetary system that is corrupt. So you can say, yeah, there's a lot of corruption here and it's bad, and I'm not going to ever belittle this because people can see this, but I would like to see a time when people see the immorality of a transfer society that is using the dictatorship of a majority, and all you have to do is have a loud voice to say, oh, we need people, we need help for people, and if you're not for it, if you're not for the military complex, or if you're not for the pharmaceutical companies, then you're un-American and you're an evil person. So we have a long way to go with the big picture, and this is something that is not going to be attended to this year.
Yeah. Can't trust the Department of Justice, and there's so many questions now about Merrick Garland. How many handcuffs did he put on investigators and whistleblowers, not allowing them to get into this investigation of Hunter Biden? What else did he do? Now we know the FBI has been shown to have been less than on the up and up in this whole thing as well. We've got whistleblowers from the FBI talking about it. So the question is, can we trust the federal government? And I think the answer is pretty obvious right now. So there needs to be an inquiry. So when we're saying it may backfire, we're not saying, hey, just let it go, just drop. We're saying that be careful because this is some dangerous ground. Yeah.
Folks, you're gonna like what's coming up here. Because today I've been asked to address another issue that finds the two major candidates, we'll call them McBama, in agreement, namely money and the Federal Reserve System. What's the difference, right? None. Since the Fed was established in 1913, the dollar has lost 95% of its value. The Federal Reserve System has given us more financial bubbles than we can count. When it inflates the money supply, it lowers the value of the dollars in Americans' pockets and hurts society's most vulnerable. It redistributes wealth from the middle class and the poor to the politically well-connected by means of what economists call distribution or Cantillon effects. F.A. Hayek won the Nobel Prize in economics for showing how central banks, like the Fed, create the boom-bust cycle in our economy. Because when the central bank manipulates interest rates, it causes massive discoordination. The interest rate is supposed to coordinate production across time, but it can do so only if it reflects an aggregate of voluntary choices, not the whim of the Fed chairman. Entrepreneurs are misled by the Fed into making investments that make no sense in light of current resource availability, and the Fed's intervention creates a boom that leads inevitably to a bust. Well, thankfully, more and more financial analysts are coming to recognize what's called the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Now wait. This is an educated crowd. I say the Austrian theory of the business cycle, you know it. Let's go ask John McCain what he knows about Hayek's theory. We may as well be speaking Chinese. In the 1920s, when so-called mainstream economists were foolishly assuring us that permanent prosperity had arrived, it was the so-called Austrian school of economic thought, of which Ron Paul is a member, that predicted the Great Depression alone. And yet, in spite of all this, we've had no serious discussion of the Federal Reserve System in our political life for nearly 100 years. It has been fantastically successful in depoliticizing itself. No politician ever mentions it. And although he is too genuinely humble to acknowledge it, one man is responsible for finally blasting open this forbidden question: Ron Paul.
So the U.S. and its allies are worried that Ukraine's stalled counteroffensive means the war between Russian and Ukrainian forces will be an open-ended conflict. And this is according to a report from the Wall Street Journal that was published on Tuesday. The report said the U.S. was hoping that Ukraine would regain some territory, and that would pave the way for a negotiated settlement. Although, I find it hard to believe that the Biden administration is really thinking about diplomacy at all, since it has discouraged negotiations throughout the war. But President Biden did say earlier this month, quote, "My hope is and my expectation is you'll see that Ukraine makes significant progress on their offensive and it generates a negotiated settlement somewhere along the line," end quote. But without any significant Ukrainian gains, the West is preparing to support the proxy war against Russia for years to come. So an unnamed Western diplomat told the Wall Street Journal, quote, "The only real response is an industrial mobilization that will give Ukrainians and the Russians a clear message that the Ukrainians will always have plenty of what they need," end quote. So this diplomat said that the U.S. should, get ready to accept that the war will not end anytime soon. Biden administration officials have repeatedly said that they're willing to arm Ukraine for as long as it takes, but it's unclear if the U.S. and its NATO allies can sustain support for Ukraine, as officials are warning Western military stockpiles are running low. So you notice what that Western diplomat said that they need an industrial mobilization, and that has all sorts of implications if it's something the U.S. would, invoke the Defense Production Act. I think those are ideas that they're talking about right now within NATO is, turning car factories into ammunition factories like they did during World War II. All right, the next one here is some bad news. Victoria Nuland promoted to acting Deputy Secretary of State. So this article is from Responsible Statecraft from Connor Eccles. In a little remarked move, the Biden administration announced Monday that Victoria Nuland will take over as the acting second-in-command at the State Department. She replaces Wendy Sherman, who plans to retire at the end of this week. I didn't see this reported anywhere else, and they linked to here an announcement from Blinken saying how great Wendy Sherman is. She's the Deputy Secretary of State, and he mentions that Victoria Nuland will be replacing her as the acting Deputy Secretary of State. Nuland's appointment will be a boon for Russia hawks who want to turn up the heat on the Kremlin. But for those who favor a negotiated end to the conflict in Ukraine, a promotion for the notoriously undiplomatic diplomat will be a bitter pill. And I certainly agree with that sentiment. So a few quick reminders about who Nuland is. When she was serving in the Obama administration, she had a now infamous leaked call with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. So this was as the Maidan was going on, the coup in Ukraine, and she was speaking with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and expressed support for putting Arseniy Yatsenuk into power. And then just later that month, Yatsenuk was the prime minister of Ukraine in the post-coup government after they threw out Yanukovych. And at one memorable point in the call, Nuland said F the EU in response to Europe's softer stance on the protest. So the controversy surrounding the call and the larger implications of U.S. involvement in the ouster of Yanukovych kicked up tensions with Russia and contributed to Putin's decision to seize Crimea and support an insurgency in eastern Ukraine. And, this all sparked that war in eastern Ukraine, this coup. So her handing out of food to demonstrators on the ground in Kiev, everybody knows about that. Victoria Nuland was walking around handing out cookies to protesters. You just imagine a protest in Canada or something, and there's Russian officials walking around handing out treats. It's just, we can't even wrap our minds around that. So Nuland, along with State Department sanctions czar Daniel Fried, they led the effort to punish Putin through sanctions. And she's known to be, basically the hardest line official on Russia in the Obama administration at the time. Now it's tough to say. I mean, you have Blinken and Sullivan there, very hard line as well. So Nuland's hawkish inclinations continued after she left the Obama administration back in 2020. She penned a foreign affairs essay titled Pinning Down Putin, in which she called for a permanent expansion of NATO bases in the alliance's eastern flank. And she was also opposed to the idea of extending the New START treaty, or a free rollover of the New START, as she called it. And that was the last remaining nuclear arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia that President Biden and President Putin renewed in 2021. So since returning to the State Department under President Biden, she has showed little interest in a dovish turn. In an interview earlier this year, Nuland called Putin a 19th century autocrat and justified Ukrainian attacks in Crimea, which Russia has called the Red Line. She said that the U.S. supports Ukrainian attacks in Crimea. So with U.S.-Russia tensions at their highest point in decades, Russia knows exactly who Nuland is. This is going to be received, very negatively in Moscow. China hits back at Japan over Taiwan comments. So the Chinese Foreign Ministry on Tuesday hit back at Japan over comments made by a Japanese official about Tokyo potentially assisting Taiwan in the event of a Chinese attack. So Toshiro Ino, who's Japan's Minister of State for Defense, made the comments in an interview with The Telegraph that was published on Sunday. He said that if countries around the world support Taiwan like the U.S. and its allies are backing Ukraine, then it would be very possible that we will provide some kind of support to Taiwan. He said that he's unsure if it would mean military aid or other types of support. He said, quote, I am not sure at this juncture whether it is going to be defense equipment support or whether it is going to be logistics support, end quote. So responding to these comments, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning warned Tokyo to stop playing with fire on the issue of Taiwan. She said, quote, the remarks of the incumbent high-level official of Japan's Defense Department constitute blatant interference in China's internal affairs, end quote. She said that the comments have a damaging effect on the political foundation of China-Japan relations. She reaffirmed China's desire to bring Taiwan under its control, saying the, quote, complete reunification of the motherland is the common aspiration of all the sons and daughters of the Chinese nation and an unstoppable historical trend, end quote. Japan is currently undergoing a major military buildup to bring its total military spending to over 2% of its GDP over the next 5 years, up from 1% of its GDP. The buildup is being done in the name of countering China, as the government of Prime Minister Fumio Kishida released a national security strategy that called Beijing the biggest strategic challenge, and that is echoing language in U.S. military strategy documents. And of course, the U.S. is encouraging all of this. They're encouraging Japan's military buildup and encouraging Japan to boost military ties with other nations as its efforts to build an alliances in the region. And this policy breaks from Japan's post-World War II constitution that was imposed by the U.S., that says Japan can only have a military for self-defense. Now they're buying, long-range missiles, so this is a big aspect of what is happening over there. All right, the last story here in the news section, the U.S. will not be cutting military aid for Israel, which probably doesn't sound like news. So while the Biden administration has expressed concern about the judicial overhaul being pushed forward by the Israeli government of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, it has made clear U.S. military aid to Israel will not be affected. This is State Department Deputy Spokesman Vedant Patel. He said on Tuesday, quote, there is not going to be any cut or stoppage of military aid, and that is because our commitment to Israel and our commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. Our decades-long partnership with Israel is ironclad, end quote. So the U.S. provides Israel with $3.8 billion in military aid each year. So his comments came a day after Israel's Knesset voted to abolish Israel's reasonableness standard, which eliminates the Supreme Court's ability to block government decisions it deems unreasonable. The law passed amid massive demonstrations against the judicial overhaul and a vote of 64-0, as the opposition did not vote in protest.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
Again, it's the devolution of society. And it's right there in front of our eyes. Blimpitis. Yep. And again, I make this very clear why this happens, and I'm hated for saying this. It's when mommies stop raising their babies. You gotta go to work. You gotta go to work. If you don't go to work, you're a jerk because you're smarter than men. Oh, and if only women were in charge, there wouldn't be any wars. Yeah. Like Samantha Powers, not a war that she didn't love. How about Hillary Clinton? Forgot Margaret Thatcher. What about Madeline, not all that bright? Oh, I forgot about Condoleezza Rice. What about Susan Rice? When mothers stop raising their children and putting them in daycare centers for children, which are nothing more than old age homes, putting them in a nursing home. That's all daycare centers are, nursing homes for children. And you got a stranger feeding your kid crap. Can't understand why everybody blimped out. Listen, if I get elected, I want a fat tax. The more you weigh, the more you pay. I don't want to pay for your blimpitis. And again, all the talk about the COVID war, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 61% of the 1 to 17-year-olds who were hospitalized were obese. Can't figure it out. Oh, you mean the people that were dying from COVID, type 2 diabetics, people suffering from respiratory ailments, obesity? Don't talk about good health. You are banned. You are not allowed to speak about natural healing. Again, one of the books I've written, along with international bestseller, Trends 2000, my favorite with Zizzy Gave Honey Boy. You still could get that one at trendsjournal.com. And trend tracking, far better than Megatrends Time magazine. And the first book I worked on, 1988, a Warner book, Natural Healing. And I have an honorary doctor from the National University of Health Sciences. So an ugly fuckface like that guy, Hotez or whatever he is. Oh, 200 people, 1,000 people would have died that died needlessly if they didn't get the shot. Oh, the Operation Warp Speed gene therapy inoculation ever first injected into a human being. Oh, that one rather than natural healing. You know, fuck off, Salenti. Why eat properly? Why take good care of yourself? Oh, how about that drug that they're all selling, huh? Oh, this is in the Cartoon News Network. Front page story. They took blockbuster drug for weight loss and diabetes. Now their stomachs are paralyzed. Why, that's misinformation. How dare you say anything about the drug dealers? The FDA approved it. The scumbags in the revolving door, like that fucking prick who was the head of the FDA in the tobacco part and got a job with Philip Morris. It's one revolving door. Not only there, look at the guy that's playing our defense secretary, Lloyd Austin. What was his last job? Oh, he sat on the board of directors of Raytheon, the second largest defense contractor. So there you got it. Blockbuster drugs for weight loss and diabetes. Now their stomachs are paralyzed. And we've been writing about this in your Trends Journal week after week. And we have articles by Dr. Joseph Mercola and others about how to stay healthy. How much is the Federal Reserve going to raise interest rates? The guess on the street, 98% are saying they're going to raise them 25 basis points. And now it's a guess whether they're going to raise them again. So it's very simple. When they stop raising interest rates or say they're going to stop raising interest rates, the dollar is going to decline. The dollar is only strong because interest rates are high. And death of the dollar, a number of articles in this Trends Journal showing where it's going and why. So now, when interest rates go down, the dollar goes down and gold prices will go up. And interestingly enough, oil prices are going back up. You go back several weeks ago, they were around $70 a barrel for Brent crude. Now, today, they almost hit $83 a barrel. Back down a little bit, about $82.30 something a barrel for Brent crude. This week, last week, oil prices went up in the last several days in the United States. The gas prices at the pump went up over 6 cents. Yeah, it's down from the high of last year, but it's still high. And it's going to get higher. It's going to get higher for 3 reasons. Number one, supply is going down. Demand is moving up a bit. The 2 reasons that no one's talking about other than us, the Middle East meltdown. You saw what's going on in Israel. And we have a number of articles going on about the apartheid state of Israel. Yes, that's what we call it because that's what the UN calls it. And that's what human rights organizations call it. And we call it that too. And Phil Giraldi, former top CIA guy, the guy that walked into little Georgie Bush's office back then and gave him the data showing there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Yeah, that Phil Giraldi, who spoke at one of our rallies last year, he has an article too about what's going on in Israel and how bad this thing is going to get and why. So, as I say, when all else fails, they take you to war. So watch for the United States and Israel ramp up tensions against Iran, and the Israelis ramping up tensions and killing more Palestinians and possibly going into Lebanon. They will get the people's minds off what's going on in Israel as hundreds of thousands of people are taking to the streets in protest about the judicial reform acts that they just pushed through. Then the Ukraine war is heating up. Ukraine announced that they're going to be bombing more and more Moscow and Crimea. The more that they send bombs and missiles into drones into Russia, the more Russia's going to ramp up the war. Oil prices? Yeah. How about the price of life on Earth? And then articles on the presidential reality show about a half of U.S. voters say they're open to a third party. And by the way, bye-bye DeSantis. I think a quarter or a third of his staff is gone already. And this guy's going nowhere fast. So also, remember on August 6th, coming up soon, I'll be speaking at the Humanity for Peace rally. And that's at the United Nations. So try to be there. Go to their site, Humanity for Peace. Support peace because we're doing everything we can. And a bunch of great speakers will be there, including Scott Ritter, my buddy. And of course, you know the way I feel about politicians. And that's why we have these shirts.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
You pointed out in your article that a coalition of 13 Republican state attorneys general sent a letter to the CEOs of all Fortune 100 companies. What was that letter all about?
So, yeah, there's been a couple of major developments, I think, in the pushback against DEI. And, it's worth saying the table here, Tom, just for a second, if I may. This is all happening in the aftermath of the long overdue overturning of so-called affirmative action at the U.S. Supreme Court, which happened under a month ago, still at this point. It was towards the end of June. And after that, the question many of us had is, okay, we have finally seen this vindication of a colorblind constitution, of a colorblind Title VI when it comes to affirmative action. It took way too long. I mean, the road from Brown versus Board of Education to Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and UNC Chapel Hill took almost 70 years, 69 years, if my back of the envelope math is correct. And the question many of us had is, okay, now this happened, what's going to come next in the fight for colorblindness and the fight against race consciousness and the fight against racial determinism? Frankly, in the fight to uphold Martin Luther King's vision that we are judged not by the color of our skin, by the content of our characters, and the fight against the Ibram X. Kendi anti-racism intersectional vision, which frankly is kind of just the bastard flip side of the same coin, if you will, of John C. Calhoun's own form of racial determinism and race centricity in the antebellum years. That really, frankly, is what you saw, actually, from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson in her horrible dissent in the affirmative action cases. And to your point, I've been delighted that there's been a couple of major letters that have been written just over the past few weeks in the aftermath of the affirmative action cases. So one was written by a coalition of 13 Republican state attorneys general. It was led by Chris Kobach of Kansas and Jonathan Skrmetti of Tennessee. And they wrote this letter to the CEOs of the Fortune 100 companies. And they basically, just to kind of briefly quote the letter, were trying to, quote, remind the CEOs of their, quote, obligations as employers under federal and state law to refrain from discriminating on the basis of race, whether under the label of diversity, equity, and inclusion or otherwise. And they cite Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And the upshot, the point of this letter is, and Tom Cotton, the esteemed senator from Arkansas, sent a very similar letter to 51 of the largest global and national law firms, also mentioning the plain text of both Title VI and Title VII. So very similar letters that they were sent to the Fortune 100 and big law, basically, warning them about DEI and warning them that these roving commissars, these roaming bands of diversity crats who exist in Title IX offices on university campuses, who exist in the HR divisions of God knows how many corporations and law firms and whatnot throughout America, basically warning them that to the extent these DEI offices are actually discriminating on the basis of race, which they pretty much almost all are because that is their reason for existing, then they are flouting the law and that they are thereby put under scrutiny, that they will be scrutinized by these attorney general and by the members of Congress for purposes of lawsuits, investigations, subpoena power, all of the above. And it's not clear exactly how much more we could ask for at this exact stage. Ideally, we would like to see some litigation to kind of ultimately extirpate this horrible cancer of DEI from our nation. But for right now, this was a heck of a start, and I've been quite pleased with it.
All right, let me play devil's advocate here a little bit. I am more opposed to affirmative action than basically anybody. I mean, I yield to nobody in my opposition to it. I think it's destructive for absolutely everybody involved. There are very, very few clear and unambiguous beneficiaries. I mean, maybe people who staff the bureaucracies of the affirmative action establishment, maybe they benefit, but I don't think anybody else really benefits from it. But having said that, the real problem with DEI is that if I have a firm and I decide I'm going to hire exclusively on merit, and if that means that my workforce is not in direct racial proportion to the proportion of the various races in society at large, I can get in trouble. I can wind up with the Justice Department knocking on my door, the Civil Rights Commission, or whatever it is. So the real problem then is that I have to hire under duress, basically. I can't just consider merit. I have to consider, well, I don't want to be sued. I don't want to lose my livelihood. I don't want my reputation destroyed. So I have all these other considerations that go into the hiring process. So to me, the big problem is we have this enormous anti-discrimination bureaucracy that stifles the labor market and makes it irrational. So to me, I would be quite satisfied, even though I know a lot of people will still make stupid hiring decisions, if we simply said, you can hire on whatever basis you want, and if it comes out that it's not exactly even, if you don't have 12% black or this or that percent of whoever, you're not going to get in trouble. I'd be satisfied with that. But it seems like these Republican attorneys general are saying, no, we want to keep a huge bureaucracy overseeing the hiring process all over America, except this time we're going to make sure that it conforms to our principles. How about we just say, go ahead and hire anybody you want to hire, and you have to live with the consequences?
I mean, that's fine as a first principle. I mean, that's basically the Barry Goldwater stance in 1964, and that's a perfectly legitimate libertarian stance to take as a matter of political philosophy and public policy. That is entirely the ambit of the Congress to make those decisions. The ambit of the attorneys general is to enforce the law, and it is certainly the ambit of these Republican conservative attorneys general to try to enforce the law and to do their best within their own limited ambit of their own constitutional authority to try to enforce the law in a direction that will kind of nudge the polity, that will nudge the legal culture towards a system where we do not judge people on the basis of race, and extending, if they can, the holding and the ruling in Students for Fair Admissions in a salutary direction.
Well, the very day that the decision was handed down, I got an email because I'm on Harvard's mailing list as an alumnus. I got an email from them in which, I mean, it was like tearful. They were beside themselves. They hardly knew what to do. But if you read the wording of it, it was quite brazen. In effect, what they were saying is, we have a lot of smart people over here at Harvard, and we're going to put our heads together and basically figure out a way to get around this. That was the way I read it. I don't know if you saw it also, but I read it as, we are going to figure out a way around this where technically we are in compliance, but maybe in the spirit of things, and if we're being honest with ourselves, we're not. Do you think there's wiggle room for them, or what do you think they're going to try to do?
Yeah. So I saw that same email, and it was not a good email. You are right to flag it. You are totally correct to do that. Look, I have no doubt that there are any number of kind of miscreants and malefactors in higher education, which itself has increasingly become a monolithic cesspool of liberalism and elite progressivism. I have no doubt that there are any number of people in admissions offices who are going to try to flout or undermine, more subtly than openly flouting perhaps, the rulings in Students for Fair Admissions. And it's ultimately going to come not just on attorneys general, not just on prosecutors, although they certainly have a role to play here as well, but it's ultimately going to come on we the people to try to an extent, self-police, to try to file lawsuits that could deter poor actions, bad actions by these officers, and from trying to undermine effectively the ruling. What I mean by that is university admissions officers, this is a key point, and this is kind of why I take a glimmer of hope. It's important to note that university admissions officers, post Students for Fair Admissions in this new world that we are living in, they are personally liable for monetary damages under the civil rights statutes, 1981, 1983, and so forth, if they are found liable in court for actually using race when it comes to admissions decisions there.
I remember when Ruth Bader Ginsburg said things like, I admired her because she fought for what she believed in. And I don't know if the word is taunt, but let's say I would reply to people like that on Twitter, and I would say, that just goes to show that most people have no idea what the role of a Supreme Court justice is. It is not your role to, quote, fight for what you believe in. But I think that that kind of advocacy and activist mentality is what yields you a regime like DEI, in which a lot of the courts will uphold this and pretend that it's normal and that it's perfectly okay to persecute a firm that isn't actively engaged in it. It's that. And the idea that actually The purpose of the Supreme Court is to interpret the law. It's not to, quote, fight for what you believe in. I mean, I know that sounds plausible, but that is not the point of it.
Yeah, look, I mean, some of this is just bread and butter separation of powers stuff. I mean, the Congress makes the law, the executive branch enforces the law, and the judiciary interprets the law. I mean, we've all read that famous quote from Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 78, where the courts have neither force nor will, but merely judgment, and depend upon the efficacy of the executive branch, even for the enforcement of their own opinions. And by the way, that's kind of why Article 3 judicial opinions, or court opinions more generally, are just called opinions, because it is the opinion of the court, and it's trying to persuade other actors in the system as to the correctness of the adjudication, as to the correctness of the ruling, and thereby in trying to persuade the executive branch, hoping that the executive branch, due to its own goodwill, will choose to enforce that decision rather than to flout it, like Andrew Jackson did back with the Trail of Tears and other various examples like that.
I mean, what do you think? Do you think you should go if you were advising him, if he called you up?
Well, I wouldn't have a strong opinion. I probably would lean toward it because I generally have had a rule that the other candidates are irrelevant.
Yeah, true.
You know, or talk about the issues and how maybe, you know, there's 6 or 7, and I say, you know, I think the monetary policy is very important, and the rest of the candidates generally still have strong support for the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
Put them in a block and,
that's true.
and not worry about the personality. But the media loves the personality, and the politicians tend to as well.
I think the tide is turning. I mean, after we've talked about it so many times, but after the Twitter files have been released and people know what's going on, people know that the government is colluding with business to censor and to destroy voices that they don't like, that don't support the government narrative. I think the tide is turning in our favor, turning against censorship, because I think Americans, for all of our faults, we instinctively bristle when someone tells us we're not allowed to hold a thought, you know, or say a word.
I don't think most of the European countries wanted the war either. It's clear what happened, which is that, you know, from the beginning, we promised in 1992. The Russian leadership said, we will move, this was Gorbachev, said when the Soviet Union, he was getting ready to dismantle the Soviet Union, and he said, we're going to withdraw 400,000 troops from East Germany. And we're going to allow you to reunite Germany under NATO, which was a hostile army. That's a huge concession for them. The one commitment that we want, is what the Russians said, is that you will not move NATO to the east. James Baker, who was then Secretary of State under Bush, famously promised, we will not move NATO 1 inch to the east. Well, since then, we've moved it 1,000 miles in 14 countries. Now, when we started that plan in 1997, Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense under Clinton, said to the Clinton administration, if you move NATO to the east, I'm resigning because you are forcing the Russians to come to war with us. George Kennan, who was the most important diplomat in American history, the architect of the containment policy during World War II, said the same thing. You do not need to make an enemy out of Russia. Russia should be treated the way we won the Cold War.
It gets complicated.
But that statement there is powerful. You could almost make a campaign. Of course, I remember somebody trying to make a whole campaign out of it. It was a very popular thing to talk about. Right. Bring the troops on. Why are we in the Middle East and all of this thing? So he does such a great job. And I've been Bill O'Reilly's going nuts because Robert was using history.
Yeah.
What right does he have to use history? You mean we promised that we wouldn't do this and we broke our promise? But there's not 2% of the American people that know that. And that is why, as far as the Democrats are concerned, and Republicans, that's a dangerous man out there telling the truth. And what if they find out it's all a fake war for other reasons? And then they wonder why you don't win fake wars. Well, you're not intended to win them. They're intended to have another type of political system. It's to perpetuate an empire, or protect it, or enlarge it. The fact that we didn't live up to our promises was to expand our empire. So we go from Eastern Europe over to, from Western Europe over to Eastern world, break down all our promises, and then they say, oh, those Russians, they're the ones who started all this. And then in 1992 that he mentions, what about 2014? It climaxed in a coup of a Russian, a government that was wanting to be friendly with Russia. But that is just absent from the debate, unfortunately.
And all Hannity could say was, well, but Putin's a monster. I hope he dies. And RFK said, okay, yeah, maybe that's true, but here are the other facts that are also important to know. You know, he's like,
I was asked, which one is worse, this distortion about, the mandates for COVID, or the climate change people? Which one has been accomplished more, and why are they different? That sort of thing. They're exactly the same thing. Yeah. It's manipulation of public opinion to try to convince people that you better be scared because you need us. You need the real science. Oh, no, you don't need a real science. science doesn't work. we have to give up on science, so we have to do the other things. But you do need help, and people have to be scared first. I still hear it from people that you think should be intelligent enough that there's something fishy going on here. But no, they'll do it. They'll say, no, maybe they are not perfect, but somebody has to protect us against these viruses and do all these things. And they're protecting us against all the enemies around the world as we manufacture the enemies.
Yeah.
We create the enemies. We're protecting ourselves from the Chinese. They're one bad group of people, is the claim. And of course, they're miles apart from where we are. But what are we doing? How many ships do we have over there in the South China Sea trying to provoke some activity there that will accelerate the fighting and the killing? And that is a real problem. But the people who are warning us of the problem are saying, that's why we have to do more.
Yeah.
We need more weapons, more money, and we have to scare the American people. The Chinese are guilty of everything, but just like Robert pointed out, that it's not like we as Americans have been totally innocent, and the Russians were at fault for the whole war. I mean, that's a stretch. And just like people finally woke up over COVID, they're going to wake up over this foreign policy as well. I think they've essentially woke up over the lies told to get us in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So far, Bush isn't going down in history as one of our great presidents, and he wanted to be a war president because he thought that was the road to greatness.
Yeah, what a creep. And we've all seen those photos of 10 or 15 Bradleys and Leopards all blown up. They tried to use it, but instead, and this is what's, I think, my prediction, and many others as well, when things continue to go badly, it's going to be all Ukraine's fault. Even though they were promised, we'll give you everything you need to win this war. Oh, you're starting to lose? Hey, it's all your fault.
You wonder, why do they do it? Why did the Ukrainians go along with this and get involved by being pushed by outsiders? But maybe it isn't just their ineptness in not following what they've been instructed, and they weren't good students, and they're not using the weapons properly. And maybe they are obeying the higher ups. Maybe there's people who are pulling the strings, that the purpose wasn't to have Ukraine other than a cesspool of fighting and killing between East and West, and keep the precipitation of this going. But it's a starting of this. How did they go? How did NATO manage to do that? They had to get a lot of people saying, oh yeah, well, I don't know how they get them, because it already exists, the fighting between Ukrainians and Russia and all that. But the people get scared. Oh, I guess NATO will have to help us. But then there's sometimes when it gets so long, it's so stupid. It's hard for me that people would be that dumb to keep. How long? I mean, right now, not only have they run out of weapons, we're running out of money, and we're gonna run out of soldiers. Matter of fact, that's why we worried the other day about, are we going to need a draft, because nobody wants to join this army that participates in this.
Yeah, well, what's happening, the panic is happening now. The panic is happening because it's now obvious that the weapons are not very good. The Bradleys aren't doing well, the Leopards aren't doing well. All of the Wonder weapons are not achieving what they were supposed to achieve. And now the tactics aren't working well. The way they've been trained, NATO trained them, is not working well. And at the beginning of this conflict, our friend Colonel Doug McGregor said, he predicted this is going to actually be the end of NATO, the death of NATO, because they're getting into something that they simply can't win. And everyone thought he was nuts. I think every day that passes, more and more looks like Colonel McGregor is right. And in fact, I'm going to close with that thought, because that reminds me to remind you that Colonel McGregor will be at our conference. And won't you want a chance to listen to what he has to say, now that he's been proven right, to say hello to him, to hear his speech. The conference is Which Way America. Colonel McGregor will be joining Dr. Paul, myself, and many others to speak on where are we headed. And it's not just military, it's our domestic policy, our civil liberties.
Look at how members of Congress treat the Fed chairman when he appears before them. He gets asked only the most inane, sycophantic questions. Members of the Banking Committee, decked out in their I Heart Bernanke t-shirts, are waving incense in front of him. Ron Paul, on the other hand, looks him in the eye and says, "You are stealing from the poor." Now, the economic and historical arguments against sound money, by which I mean money that government can't just print up at will, are surprisingly weak. They're really just a string of fallacies. And there is, or imminently will be, at the Campaign for Liberty website, a whole education page with all the resources you need to defend sound money. But Joseph Schumpeter, one of the great economists of the 20th century, said that even if you accept all the bogus arguments against gold, it still makes perfect sense to favor it. Why? because it is the only system compatible with freedom. If fiscal responsibility is your issue, you'll never get anywhere as long as the government can create out of thin air all the money it wants. If the federal government is an addict, then the Federal Reserve is the enabler. Or let's suppose you're concerned about war and what Ron Paul calls our bull in a china shop foreign policy. And by the way, that's a concern that's shared by the genuine left, people like Kirkpatrick Sale and Gore Vidal, and the genuine right, people like Russell Kirk, traditional conservatives like Robert Taft as well, not today's neoconservative death cult. But if you're concerned about war, you should care about the Fed, because the Fed, the central bank, is the lifeblood of the empire. If you want to stop the war machine, you have to go after the money machine. Public stands up.
War.com today, the U.S. says that the main thrust of Ukraine's counteroffensive has started. So U.S. officials told the New York Times on Wednesday that the main thrust of Ukraine's counteroffensive has begun, while the U.S. military reported a massive Ukrainian tank attack in the southern Zaporozhye Oblast. So unnamed Pentagon officials told the Times that Ukraine has poured in thousands of troops who are being held in reserves to the front lines, and most of these troops have received NATO training in European countries ahead of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. So the Russian Defense Ministry said that there was heavy fighting to the south of Orikhiv, which is a Ukrainian-controlled town in Zaporozhye. A Russian Defense Ministry spokesman said that Ukrainian forces carried out a massive attack by 3 battalions reinforced by tanks. He said, quote, all of the Ukrainian army's attacks were repelled by courageous and professional actions, end quote. He also claimed that Russian forces destroyed 22 tanks, 10 infantry vehicles, and an armored combat vehicle, and over 100 Ukrainian personnel. So if you're watching the video here, you see this is a map of the Zaporozhye region from South Front, and you can see this is where the bulk of the fighting happened to the south of this town. So it looks like this is a big attack here from the Ukrainian side. And according to the New York Times, Ukrainian soldiers fighting on the southern front said that they'd been steadily pushing against Russian troops, steadily pushing them back, but they said the progress has been incremental with no major breakthroughs. So this new push appears to be, a last-ditch effort to break through after the first phase of the counteroffensive had been unsuccessful. Ukraine's goal is to sever the land bridge that Russia has secured from Crimea to the Russian mainland. And Ukrainian officials are telling the U.S. that the new operation could take 1 week to 3 weeks if it is successful. A U.S. official told the New York Times that this is the big test. So the U.S. is kind of banking on this succeeding, or at least the Ukrainians are. And, as we know from what I've been covering lately, Ukrainian success seems unlikely. The Wall Street Journal reported over the weekend that Western officials did not believe Ukraine had enough weapons or training in the first place for this counteroffensive to dislodge Russian forces. And leading up to the counteroffensive, the Discord leaks media reports have showed us that the U.S. did not think Ukraine could regain much territory. But this kind of signals that this counteroffensive only has a few more weeks left. And, unless they do really break through, which again seems unlikely, it's not clear, what's going to happen after that next few weeks. So the North Atlantic Alliance will step up its aerial surveillance of Russian activity in the Black Sea as tensions in the region rise. Moscow recently withdrew from the Black Sea grain export agreement and warned that it would consider civilian ships potentially carrying military supplies to Kiev. On Tuesday, at a meeting of the NATO-Ukraine Council, Alliance head Jens Stoltenberg announced the increase in Black Sea operations. He said, quote, Russia's actions also pose substantial risks to the stability of the Black Sea region, which is of strategic importance to NATO. Allies are stepping up support to Ukraine and increasing our vigilance. We remain ready to defend every inch of Allied territory from any aggression, end quote. In a press release, NATO explained that the increased vigilance will come in the form of spy plane and drone flights. The statement said, quote, NATO and allies are stepping up surveillance and reconnaissance in the Black Sea region, including with maritime patrol aircraft and drones, end quote. Stoltenberg went on to attack the Kremlin for withdrawing from that grain agreement. And again, Russia says they pulled out because they weren't happy that the UN and the West didn't live up to its end of the deal, which was to make it easier for Russia to export grain and fertilizer. So this is, the Black Sea is always kind of a potential area, potential flashpoint for a conflict between the U.S. and Russia, NATO and Russia. If you remember, not that long ago, a American drone was downed after an encounter with Russian fighter jets. So, something like that happens with two manned, jets. Say if it was an American pilot that was in there and the plane went down, that could really spiral into something really quickly. And there is a lot of encounters still between Russian and NATO aircraft, not just over the Black Sea, but in the Baltic Sea as well. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken visited the Pacific island nation of Tonga for the first time on Wednesday and took aim at China, blasting Beijing's activities in the region as predatory and problematic. He said at a joint press conference with Tonga's prime minister, quote, as China's engagement in the region has grown, there has been some, from our perspective, increasingly problematic behavior, end quote. He warned against Chinese investments, claiming that Beijing was behind, quote, some predatory economic activities and also investments that are done in a way that can actually undermine good governments and promote corruption, end quote. So Tonga is located about 1,000 miles north of New Zealand and consists of about 170 islands, has a population of just over 100,000. Blinken's trip marks the first official visit to the country by a U.S. Secretary of State, as the U.S. is looking to boost ties with Pacific Island nations as part of its strategy against China. So the U.S. Marine Corps has activated its first Tomahawk cruise missile battery, which is a system that was previously banned by the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, that's the INF Treaty, which the U.S. withdrew from in 2019. So the INF banned ground-launched missile systems with a range between 310 and 3,400 miles. The new Marine Corps missile battery will use Tomahawk missiles with a range of about 1,000 miles. So the battery is the first of 4 batteries called the long-range missile batteries that the Marine Corps plans to procure. This was activated at a base in California, but they're likely going to be eventually deployed to Japan or in other areas in Asia where missiles can reach China. That's the whole idea. They're developing this to put them along what they call the first island chain, which includes Japan.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
You have an article that's coming out tomorrow. Has liberty, again, this is what I was just saying, how we lost our liberty. Has liberty died in our hearts? Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can save it. No constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. This is Judge Leonard Hand, 1872 to 1961. Boy, the cat lived a long time. You go on to say, last week, a judge on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court revealed that he had enough of the FBI and Congress trashing the Constitution. The normally secretive court and the normally secretive judge explained in a rare public opinion the unlawful behavior of the FBI agents, you ready? Spying on ordinary Americans in violation of the Fourth Amendment. The FISA judge revealed that the FBI has spied illegally on nearly 300,000 Americans in 2022.
Correct. And among them was a United States senator, not named publicly, but they have told the senator who he is, a state senator and a state judge. I'll tell you about the state judge in a minute. It's scandalous what happened to him. So right after 9/11, the most incompetent president in the modern era, George W. Bush, in order to deflect attention from his own sleepiness in the days leading up to 9/11, began to blame everybody and everything for 9/11. And the principal object that he blamed was the Constitution and the Fourth Amendment. Same Constitution he took an oath to uphold. He persuaded Congress to override the Fourth Amendment, which Congress does not have the authority to do, and tell the FBI and the NSA, you can go ahead and spy on foreigners in the U.S. without suspicion and without a warrant, just because they're foreign. Then the law says, what happens if foreigners speak to Americans? Well, if foreigners communicate with Americans, you got to take that data and put it in a database, and the FBI can only access that data with a search warrant. The FISA court judge revealed that in 2022 alone, just last year, the FBI accessed that database without a search warrant almost 300,000 times. Now, those are innocent Americans. Could be you and me. Could be the people watching and listening to us now. There's no search warrant on them. There's no suspicion about them. There's no knowledge of who they are. But the FBI, which is given custody of the database, couldn't resist the temptation to go in there without a search warrant. And it happened that many times. State trial judge observed criminal behavior by local police violating the civil rights of people in his courtroom. He complained to local authorities. They told him to go take a hike. He filed a formal complaint with the FBI. And what did the FBI do? Spied on him. You can't make this stuff up. So the point of my article is we are losing liberty. This came out on Saturday morning. The judge revealed it on Friday afternoon. There was no debate over the weekend. It was buried in the back pages of the newspapers. It wasn't even in any of the major websites. Why? Because the government's violations of the Constitution today have become so regular, consistent, and systematic that they don't shock any longer. And the more the government does this, it's just another step on the stairway to totalitarianism. The more they do this, the more they can get away with it. And the public needs to know about this. Now, this law that was passed under Bush that allows the spying without warrants on foreigners, even if they spy on Americans, expires Christmas time in 5 months. And Congress is deciding what to do about it. And Congressman Jim Jordan, Republican of Ohio, who happens to be the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, is a fierce opponent of Section 702. It may very well go down. Biden, of course, is in favor of it. The big government people in the Republican and Democratic parties in Congress are in favor of it. The people in Congress that the intelligence community has dirt on, which is almost all of them, they're in favor of it. We'll see what happens.
Guy. That shows you how low America has gone. And what did you say that of all the presidents, he was probably, what did you say?
The least competent in the post-World War II era.
Yeah.
But he shrewdly used fear of another 9/11 as an instrument to pass the Patriot Act, to amend the FISA Act, and to curtail our liberties. And we all know that liberties, once curtailed, don't come back. Once the government gets their hands on our freedom, the government is fighting maniacally to get this Section 702 reinstated. I'll tell you a funny story because it involves Donald Trump. This thing expires every 5 years. So 5 years ago, Trump was in the White House. I was still at Fox. The House and the Senate had passed the reenactment of it. Trump had one more day to sign it or veto it. I was hosting Fox and Friends in the morning. I looked in the camera. I said, Mr. President, this law that they want you to sign, this is the same authority they used to spy on you when you were in Trump Tower. And my bosses were pissed off at me, but I said it anyway. Trump tweets, I'm not signing it. Well, in the next hour, Mike Pence, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell go running to the Oval Office. And they say to Trump, don't believe the judge. He thinks the Constitution means what it says. Trump sends me a message. They twisted my arm. I had to sign it.
The hypocrisy. So going back to what you're saying here is that we have lost our freedom. And that if people don't unite and stand up for it, then we're finished. Because you went back and I wrote what you said about Bush, about how he got these clowns to sign what he wanted, and he sold fear.
Correct.
Fear is what gets the people.
Right.
88% of the people believed him. We're going to get that guy Osama bin Laden dead or alive. So now let's go back now. I think we are in for another fear crisis in the run-up to the 2024 elections to get the people off the minds off the people of the clowns, the jerks that are running this country, so they can keep staying in control and robbing us of our freedom.
I agree with you. I don't know in what form it's going to take. It may be nuclear, but obviously old Joe is poking and prodding the bear. I mean, he just called up 3,000 reservists, a relatively small number, but guess where they're going? Poland.
Yeah.
Reservists from New York, New Jersey, and Texas are going to Poland? For what?
For what?
The Polish army is at the border, and it can't wait to go into Ukraine. It would be suicidal if they did that, but the Polish leadership is prodding them on. Their
page of today's Wall Street Journal, big picture on the top, showing a Russian jet. Russian jet shoots down American drone over Syria.
What the hell are we doing in Syria?
We have no right being there.
Correct.
Oh, you mean we're spilling their oil? Is that what you're telling me?
Gerald, did Congress declare war on Syria, and did we miss that declaration of war?
We're getting them ISISes over there, don't you know? We're fighting ISIS. We're stealing their oil.
Right. Right.
We are invaded a foreign nation that is no threat to us.
Correct. Well, we've been doing that for 150 years, but we're still doing it.
Yep. Yeah, so it goes back to the conclusion of your article that If we are no longer outraged at the most obvious violations, if we elect to office those who promise to uphold it and reelect them after they've trashed it, we must recognize that we have lost freedom in our hearts, and then it is gone.
So we're going to conduct this experimentation to see what its effects will be on our workers and on the public. That was the cover story. But essentially what they were doing, yeah, it'd be useful to get that data to help protect our people. But really what we're doing here, and this was referenced in a letter written by Oppenheimer himself, asking, he said, quote, "I think that we should not attempt a plan unless we can poison food sufficient to kill 500,000 men, since there is not doubt that the actual number affected will, because of non-uniform distribution, be much smaller than this." So in these letters where they're talking about doing these human experimentations involving plutonium, he's talking about using it to kill and poison people offensively. And where it really ties into the Manhattan Project itself is, there's this age-old adage, Scott, that you've confronted yourself in your work that, well, we had to drop atom bombs on those people because they never would have surrendered, and we needed to, destroy Japan's will to resist, or else we were going to have to invade the island and lose 1 million people. So therefore, all of it was justified. Well, I really try to combat that ends justify the means approach by saying, look, they're not people who have the best of intentions. Look at here, before the project started, they picked all these scientists who were involved in destroying medical ethics and doing Nazi-style medical experimentation on people, subjecting them to radiation without expectation of medical benefit, without informed consent. Meanwhile, the United States, after the war, was prosecuting war criminals at Nuremberg for doing the same exact thing. So how can you sit there and tell me that these people had the best of intentions when they were engaging in this ridiculous human experimentation, like injecting people with plutonium without their knowledge? Civilians.
Man, and then so you have a whole section on the Manhattan Project itself and the development of the A-bomb, or you stick to all these kind of side experiments on people?
I try to give the background too. Essentially the veil of secrecy that went around the Manhattan Project, talking about its development, at least enough to give the background and the context of where these took place. Because a lot of people, when they think of the Manhattan Project, they think of Los Alamos itself. But actually, it was a nationwide coordinated project with different facilities around the country. And I think one of the most important parts about that was that this human experimentation was consciously decided by Oppenheimer to conduct the medical experimentation off-site at Los Alamos to kind of, it wasn't at Los Alamos, it was off-site of Los Alamos at these different affiliated universities. And so like the University of Rochester, UC Berkeley, were two sites where these programs were coordinated through. But I just thought it was really important, at least in part one, to give that background, but to say like, well, who the hell are these people? Why were they selected to be part of the Manhattan Project, and what are their backgrounds? And I think that going through, and Lisa Martino-Taylor does this in her book, Behind the Fog, goes through and really illustrates that these people who were selected weren't necessarily the most qualified people for the job. Lewis Hempelman, like I said, he was 29 years old. He wasn't a physicist really at all. And he only had, I think, 2 years experience working with radiation or radioactive substances at all before he was named to be the medical director of the Manhattan Project itself. And furthermore, Oppenheimer, who, of course, is the subject of this new blockbuster film that IGN called a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, he was someone who had a checkered past. He was diagnosed with profound schizophrenia. He was like collapsing to the floor and rolling around at the Cambridge University labs. He tried to poison his professor with cyanide. He tried to strangle his best friend. He was a communist. And all these other doctors, like I document in the show, they had all engaged in human experimentation with radioactive substances.
Thinking back on it, this is some of the first stuff, going back to when I was younger anyway, that I was exposed to this kind of thing. That, sort of like when I first learned about how like Wall Street and the rise of Hitler and that kind of thing, is in like all the army experiments on Americans, including germ weapons and radioactive stuff and whatever after the beginning of the Cold War, post-World War II era there. And I remember Bill Curtis on Investigative Reports on A&E had done some really good stuff on this. And I've read, whatever about it now. But that goes to show you who these people are and what they really think of us. I don't want to cite the numbers, I don't know, but there have been studies that show, however many thousands or more people who got cancer from all of the atomic testing that our government did in Nevada. You know, I mean, nuking the Marshall Islands out there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean is pretty bad and led to a lot of fallout too. But they nuked Nevada hundreds of times with A-bombs. And, you know, people downwind from that got cancer. So this is our security force building up this nuclear stockpile in the name of staving off the Soviet Union as a threat to the American people. They're literally killing people in very large numbers. I think it really was the millions over the decades who were said to have died premature deaths of cancer from that. And here I said I wasn't going to cite numbers, but that's the way I remember it. But anyway, it was certainly way too many. And, you know, talking about giving radioactive oatmeal to retarded kids or whatever, that's the ultimate. I don't know specific footnotes on that, but I remember something like that. Putting germs in Army cars and driving around New York City with a fake tailpipe. You know, and then shooting germs out the back to see how effective it would be. And infecting, they're like, well, we got to test this thing. So they tested on New York City, the city they're supposedly trying to protect from something like that happening. They're like, well, we'll just try it on them. You know, who's the bad guy then? You know, whole thing is bananas, man.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, there was the way I really discovered this and what I bought Lisa Martino Taylor's book for was to do research into the zinc cadmium sulfide experiments done by the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. And I think, this was the mid-50s through the late 1960s. The U.S. Army Chemical Corps drove through a bunch of cities in North America, spraying zinc cadmium sulfide out the back with huge blowers to do like a biological agent test. And it's just insane. I mean, that they would do this and trying to, you know, create a situation. It was a tracer experiment, but try to find comparable cities in the U.S. to Russia, to, you know, USSR, cities in the USSR. And a lot of people were claimed to be sickened and given cancer by this, but there was a lawsuit that happened, but of course it was thrown out under sovereign immunity, where like you can't sue the U.S. government unless they consent, the sovereign government.
Yep. Even though it says right there in the First Amendment that you can petition for a redress of grievances. They go, no, that just means you sign your name on a piece of paper begging, please, when that's not what that meant when they ratified that. But anyway, they do whatever they want.
Now the government and the defendant are in my courtroom and they both want the same thing. There is no dispute. The government says, we agree to the plea deal. The defendant says, we agree to the plea deal. Most judges would say, okay, plea deal is accepted, because the judicial job is not to make law. It's not to make public policy. It's not to say who's good and who's bad. It's to resolve disputes. And if there is no dispute, the case is over. That's the way most judges would look at it. When I was on the bench, I did not do that. When I was on the bench, I took the position, I am not a potted plant. And if I think that the penalty is too harsh, or the penalty is too light, or the agreement is to a crime that the defendant really didn't commit, it's just a made-up crime in order to get rid of the case, I'm not going to accept it. Today, the judge in the case was of that latter mentality to which your humble correspondent belonged when he was on the bench. And she basically said a couple things. One, what does the gun have to do with the tax cases? It really should be two separate cases, and I'm uncomfortable resolving both. And two, here's the kicker. Are there any other charges about to come down the pike against Hunter Biden? Now, when she said that, the defense said no, and the government said maybe. And then the defense said, well, what do you mean maybe? The purpose of this guilty plea is to resolve all of the cases against Hunter Biden in one place before one judge at one time. So then she says, oh, you guys got to talk more, because if the government has more cases, you need to know about it. Maybe you don't want him to plead to these cases. Maybe you want a universal settlement. Defense counsel, this is a universal settlement. The government told us that by entering these pleas today and entering this pretrial intervention program today, the government is finished with Hunter Biden. The government, no, we never told you that. And there are some other things we're investigating, and we may bring other charges against him. That's what caused the judge to say, okay, I am not rejecting the guilty plea forever. I'm just rejecting it today. I think you guys and gals should get together and sit down and resolve this. Now, the judge did not say what I'm about to say. There is a principle of law called the entire controversy doctrine. And it basically says, if you're going to sue somebody and you have 5 causes of action against them, you can't sue them for one and resolve it and then sue them for the other 4. You got to bring all 5 at once. If you're going to prosecute somebody and you got 5 causes of action, you can't prosecute them for 3 and hold 2 back. You got to prosecute them for all 5 at once. You got to lay your cards on the table. We're not playing games here. So if the government has more potential charges against Hunter Biden under the Constitution, he's entitled to know what those charges are. And the government is required to lay them out so that when a guilty plea is entered, it's a universal guilty plea. It ends all the prosecutions against him. I don't know what defense counsel knew when they walked into the courtroom this morning. The government says defense counsel knew there were more charges coming. Defense counsel says, no, we didn't. You specifically told us this is it. The judge doesn't know. But the judge, in my opinion, did absolutely the right thing.
Special type of program today?
That's right. You get put in the hot seat. And this is a very popular thing that we've done here. And it's where we let our viewers ask some questions and get your take on some things. Ask Ron Paul, we call it, as our viewers know. So let's go right to the questions. Let me ask this question. Which historical event do you think was most significant in our drift from more freedom to more fascism? From our COVID response all the way back to the forming of the Union and everything in between.
It's a big question because there have been so many events. There's been a lot of gradualism, and the founders, expected that to happen and warned us against it, because the document of the Constitution was there to prevent this from happening. But they also knew about the imperfection of man, where people, bend the rules, and soon after they get their liberties, they undermine them. But I would say the first century or so, things did pretty well. But a lot of people now think about the very current events going on, and that would be, the violation of our civil liberties with COVID, and also the things going on, with this insanity about globalism, and also the idea of weather and the problems that we have there. But I would say that even in the first 100 years, we had problems. Certainly, there was a challenge to the Republic during the Civil War period, and there are some people who believe we never fully recovered from that. But the whole country was torn apart, but we did survive that, and we went back to a decent system up until the 20th century. And but during that time, I would say it was that period of time that the real erosion of the Republic occurred, and it really opened up the door to a more fascist system. And that was with the progressive era, because I think most things are a result of bad ideas and education. But the educational system in this country changed in the progressive era, and then also the taking over during the 20th century of our government school system has led to the ideology that actually tolerates a system that challenges a republic. And that has been going on for a long time. The Department of Education is good symbolism for what it gets established to challenge the republic that we had. But more recently, I've done some thinking on this and a little bit of writing about a sort of an invisible coup that has gone on, where the Republic has just been taken from us, and there's been certain events that have been bad, but there's been some that are bigger than other. And I think the coup that I'm talking about is something that I remember the beginning of, and that is the 1960s. I think it was a big event in the 1960s to have the assassinations of RFK and JFK, and also Martin Luther King. And this involved, not just miscellaneous isolated individuals who do a shooting for various reasons, but it was a strategic destruction of the government. I'm convinced our government was involved, the FBI was involved, and the evidence seems to me to be overwhelming. So that, to me, I think introduced a new era of the disintegration of our republic.
Pete on Twitter, and he asked a question. This is interesting, and I was actually really curious as to what your answer might be on this. He said, what is a political position or worldview that you have changed your opinion on in your lifetime?
But where I really had a significant change in the government's role as an enforcer of violent crimes. And I've seen the government, since I first got into politics, dealing with the death penalty. And I was naturally, in a way I thought it was natural, be favorable for the death penalty. These are bad people. They kill people. They deserve the death penalty. And then as time went on, I found out that governments are so imperfect. You find out that people have been in prison for 50 years, DNA samples come out, and they were really innocent, and all these things. I thought, well, that's overboard, to have the death penalty by the government because they're liable to make some mistakes. So I I changed my position to virtually opposed to the death penalty, especially when the federal government is involved. But that doesn't make me opposed to defending our family and our relatives and our household. So if somebody comes in one's house, I believe in the death penalty that is done in self-defense. That's different than this organized death penalty that goes on and on for months, and then overlooking the possibility of how many mistakes have they made. I mean, just think of now in this day and age where we have a corrupt Department of Justice and FBI agents doing things they shouldn't be doing, is more reason to think that we should be very, very cautious. And for that reason, I did have a significant change, but I did not give up the idea that you have a right to self-defense.
He said, if the Federal Reserve in the country as we know it collapsed tomorrow, how would you go about rebuilding it into a functional place where both sides of the country could agree to disagree? So when the collapse comes, how can we rebuild in the best way?
Well, in many ways, I would say for myself, I will continue to do the things that I've done ever since I became aware of the problems that we face, even before I ever went to Congress. And that is, ideas have to be changed. I mean, as long as we see these problems coming up, the Federal Reserve, created by the Federal Reserve, and deficit financing, tinkering on the edges and saying, well, we've got to reduce the budget by 5% here, and we have to have better monitoring of the Fed. I don't believe in any of that, because that's not going to work. I think what I started to do early on, being exposed to the freedom movement by Leonard Reed at the Foundation for Economic Education, it's that understanding. Because you can't do what you have to do if the people have no idea and they think you're doing it, making everything worse. If you come up and say, the solution to this problem today is not spending more money and bailing out people on welfare and all these problems, bankruptcies going on, all these problems caused by government. They have to understand what you're doing. And then what you want to do is, there's quite a few things you can do, and that is start reducing the size and scope of government. And that's where you run into the political problems, because you face the resistance. Under today conditions, it'd be very difficult for you to take one day and say, all right, no more Fed, no more this, and just go on. I mean, there would be a pretty violent reaction to that. But you could say, look, the first thing we're going to do is get rid of the income tax and reduce this. Another thing is where we ought to cut is get rid of all the corporate welfareism. I went to Congress thinking welfareism was those people who wouldn't work and got their food stamps for free. Well, I changed my attitude about that, because the real welfare benefits were the banks and big governments and the pharmaceutical industries, the military industrial complex. I would say cut it off, and you could save a lot of money. Cut off the foreign policy of marching around the world and maintaining this empire. If you want to help the people at home, quit wasting so much money overseas. That could be essentially immediate. And the biggest thing is restore confidence in the government. If people believe you're going to do it and you do it, all of a sudden the Congress says, well, things are bad and it's going to be tough, but if we do this, he convinced me, things will get better. Just getting the confidence factor. But where is the confidence factor today? Okay, you're having a break-in your house or your store. This call the FBI and this call the police and all this stuff. People, they don't do that, because right now, sometimes if somebody breaks in a store and you try to resist, if you resist, you might have a greater punishment than the people who robbed the store. Even if you capture or hurt the person doing the robbing, the whole thing is turned on that. So people need to know the confidence that the government has returned to sanity, and that would go a long way. But there would be a lot of things you do. But there should be a merit system, an incentive system, like what we had when people were settling this country. They didn't have all this nonsense going on. They didn't say, you know what, this is a big nation. We need a lot of bureaucrats to help tell us what to do. And how are we going to do all these things? No, you want to get rid of the bureaucrats. As a matter of fact, what you want to do is make sure people understand the issue of the Constitution about privacy, property rights, and also the Second Amendment, you being responsible for your safety. So, but I would say education about how economics works, and also having a government that you can trust. Every once in a while, you see a candidate get up and start talking and telling the truth, and it's all not pie in the sky stuff. It's the truth. The pie in the sky can come. If you do this, things can get better. People need to know and understand and believe that the philosophy you're following is worth standing up for. But they'll say, oh no, my prices are too high, and we don't need to deal with the Fed. We need the Fed to print more money and pass it out so we can buy bread. That's where the insanity is. So education is the big issue, and trustworthiness in government is a big issue too. And trust and having a moral group of people who will support those in government that will do these things. That seems to be tough love. But I'll tell you what, if we don't, we're going to have real bad chaos. But where I'm optimistic is there's a lot more education going on, talking about sound economic policies. I even see signs that people are saying, why are we spending so much money in Ukraine? Why don't we protect our borders? That's healthy. And why do we see these big demonstrations? Are they violent? No, they say, we don't like our companies supporting the woke movement, so therefore we're not going to use their product anymore. I think that's great. So that kind of stuff is moving in the right direction. But can you imagine if you had a few people in leadership in Washington talking about this, helping to convince people that they can't trust in the government? One reason we couldn't go back on the gold standard today like we did in 1875, what they did in 1875, they got rid of the greenbacks and they balanced the budget and they didn't have any wars overseas. And the people believed the government. And it was a non-event. They went back on the gold standard after three years. But now, what would you say, some of the things I'm suggesting, if you said that and you didn't understand that the people have to know why you're saying this and what it's going to do, it's not going to work because people won't believe the government. The people kept saying, well, Ron, I bet you saved some gold. What if the government said tomorrow they're going to back the dollar up at $2,500 an ounce? Which is above what the market says it is now. $2,500 an ounce. Would you turn in your gold to get $2,500? No, and I don't think anybody else would either, because $2,500 is going to be a lot more because we're still printing money faster and faster. So there's a lot we can do, but it's in education and the restoration of trust in people and a moral trust by the people.
Folks, how did Lyndon Johnson get away with his war spending in Vietnam? By a deliberate policy of concealing the cost through inflation, a cost the American people bore only later in the stagflation of the 1970s. Just the cost overruns on 2 Pentagon projects added up to more than the combined GDPs of North and South Vietnam. By silently looting the American population, the government was able to get away with much more spending than would otherwise have been possible. And then we have this disastrous war in Iraq, the propaganda for which was fed to us by America's Pravda, the New York Times. Now, how has that war been funded? By borrowing from foreigners and creating new money out of thin air. Now, as for our current economic mess, McBama agreed with the president, who summed up his own sophisticated business cycle theory in these words: Wall Street got drunk. Well, what's their solution? For starters, hundreds of billions in bailouts to the alleged drunkards. Bailouts and scapegoating, anything other than pointing the finger where it belongs, are all McBama can think to do. To hear them speak, you'd never know the Fed's mad money creation spree and all the economic distortions that result from it had even occurred. And by the way, no, the free market does not cause housing bubbles and mortgage crises. The federal government has been pushing unsound loans on banks for years, either through legislation or through the Federal Reserve's policy of flooding the economy with cheap credit. This new money went overwhelmingly into the housing market, the result being the housing bubble that is now bursting. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are government-supported enterprises that get special tax and regulatory breaks, and that everyone knows will be bailed out if it should come to that. So there's nothing to stop them from buying up risky mortgages from banks, and banks in turn are more likely to make risky loans in the first place if they know Fannie and Freddie will be happy to buy them up. Now that's more truth on this subject than you're going to get from both political conventions put together.
Ukraine extends martial law and pushes back elections. So Ukraine's parliament on Thursday voted to extend martial law and general mobilization, a move that pushes back parliamentary elections that were scheduled for October. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has previously said that elections cannot happen under martial law because it's prohibited under Ukraine's constitution. He told the Washington Post back in May, quote, "If we have martial law, we cannot have elections. The Constitution prohibits any elections during martial law. If there is no martial law, then there will be," end quote. So martial law has been extended several times since it was declared by Zelensky on February 24th, 2022, which is the day that Russia invaded. And it's expected to be extended as long as the war continues. And Ukraine's next presidential election is scheduled for March 2024, and that will also be pushed back if the war is still raging. And I mean, I'm pretty pessimistic these days, so I expect that this war will still be going on by then. So the vote on Thursday extended martial law and general mobilization for another 90 days from when it was set to expire on August 18th to November 15th. Ukraine, this martial law bans men ages 18 to 60 from leaving the country so they can be conscripted for war and thrown, into the front lines, thrown into battle. There's stories, I remember a Wall Street Journal report about kind of older men, in their 50s getting conscripted and not even being trained and being thrown into Bakhmut, being thrown into the meat grinder. So that's what this law allows the Zelensky government to do. So arms control experts have criticized the Biden administration for failing to send a proposal to Russia on maintaining limits on nuclear weapons deployments that was publicly floated by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan last month. So Sullivan said on June 2nd that the U.S. was willing to open talks with Russia on a framework to preserve curbs on nuclear arms deployments after 2026, which is the final year of the New START treaty, and that's the last nuclear arms control treaty between the two powers. So while Russia has suspended its participation in New START, both sides have said they will continue complying with the treaty's limits, and New START caps the deployment of nuclear warheads for both sides at 1,550, and it also restricts the deployment of nuclear bombers, submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Sullivan said that the U.S. was open to talks on the issue without preconditions, but last week, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said that Russia had not received any proposal from the U.S. on resuming arms control talks. He added that Moscow has studied what Sullivan said publicly and said Russia was not interested in negotiations until the U.S. changes its hostile policies against Russia, referring to the proxy war in Ukraine. Harris to meet with Taiwan's vice president. So 6 House Republicans have sent a letter to Vice President Kamala Harris urging her to meet with Taiwanese Vice President Lai Ching-te when he stops in the U.S. next month on his way to and from Paraguay, which is one of the few countries that has diplomatic relations with Taipei. So Lai is scheduled to visit Paraguay on August 15th. According to Taipei Times, Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said that Lai is expected to transit the United States on both the incoming and outgoing legs of his trip. Neither the U.S. nor Taiwan have said if Lai will meet with any U.S. officials while he's in the United States. So, as we know, Beijing is opposed to meetings between U.S. and Taiwanese government officials as it views them as a violation of Washington's One China policy. When Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen traveled through the U.S. in April, she met with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, and this marked the highest level meeting between the U.S. and Taiwan that's taken place in the United States since 1979 when Washington formally severed diplomatic ties with Taipei. So the Tsai-McCarthy meeting provoked major Chinese military drills around Taiwan, as did Nancy Pelosi's trip there when she was the House Speaker. And, if Harris meets with Lai, it's almost certainly going to provoke more military drills. Maybe China will take things to another level. It's not clear. So U.S. forces in Niger are restricting their movement and assessing the situation following a military coup that overthrew President Mohamed Bazoum. And this is what 2 Pentagon officials told NBC on Thursday. So a group of Nigerian soldiers appeared on TV on Wednesday saying that they ousted Bazoum, who was democratically elected in 2021. A spokesman for this group of soldiers, who call themselves the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland, said, quote, "The defense and security forces have decided to put an end to the regime that you are familiar with," end quote. So the following day, Niger's military released a statement saying that it supported the coup. The chief of staff of Niger's armed forces said, quote, "The military command of the Nigerian armed forces has decided to subscribe to the declaration by the defense and security forces in order to avoid a deadly confrontation between the various forces," end quote. So the U.S. condemned the military takeover and is backing Bazoum, but has stopped short of formally calling it a coup. The reason why they're not doing that is because that would mean they would have to cut off aid to the country. Secretary of State Antony Blinken did warn that the U.S. partnership with the country depends on democratic governance and respect for the rule of law. So the U.S. has a significant military presence in Niger with at least 1,016 troops in the country. That's according to a notice the White House gave to Congress recently about its presence, overseas military presences. So that's a decent amount, a little over 1,000. That's more than are in Syria, as far as we know, and Iraq. Iraq, there's 2,500. More so than Somalia. from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. Representative Jim Jordan shows proof that the White House pushed Facebook to censor Americans. So I haven't had the chance to really look through all of this, but Jim Jordan, House Representative, posted what he called the Facebook files on Twitter. And he published internal Facebook discussions exposing how the company bent to pressure from the White House and censored Americans. In the documents, the Joe Biden administration is shown pressuring Facebook to censor a popular television news host and remove a meme. And this seems to be mostly COVID related. This was in April 2021. And, this one example that he showed was the White House demanding that Facebook remove a meme that said, 10 years from now, you will be watching TV and hear, did you lose a loved one to the COVID vaccine? You may be entitled to, you get the idea. So anyway, it was that meme, and they asked Facebook to remove it, and I think they did. So,
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
So the Dow had a historic 13 straight day winning streak, but the index fell 237 points today. And if it had gained the 14th day today, it would have tied its record winning streak going back to 1897. Shows you how the fucking thing is rigged. Anyway, the news all has to do with the Fed raising interest rates 25 basis points, as we said they were going to do, as 98% of the streets said they're going to do. And now the guess is that they're going to do it again in September when they meet again. They're going to take off in August. And as we said, the higher interest rate goes, the stronger the dollar gets and the weaker gold gets. And that's exactly what happened. But then when they get to the end of raising them, that's going to be the beginning of the end, the death of the dollar, and it's going to begin the rise in gold prices. And again, we stick by our forecast that gold prices in 2023 will hit $2,200 an ounce. So the game is almost over. And over there in the EU, they just raised interest rates again today. Anyway, speaking at a news conference, European Central Bank Christine Lagarde, Ms. Fatcha-Brut, said, quote, our assessment of data will tell us whether and how much ground we have to cover. Oh, yeah? Hey, fuckface. You know the shithead that was spewing out, you just started raising interest rates last July, a year ago, that there was no fucking inflation. And calling people like Trends Journal full of shit when we said, no, this inflation's real. It was only temporary and transitory, according to her and Yellen. Oh, if only women were in charge. Yellen. How can you believe a Yellen? How can you believe a Yellen? Corporate debt was way cheap, but economy may pay price. This is the today's New York Times in the business section. Ready for this? The fear is that debt comes due and businesses still need cash, are forced to renew their financing at much higher interest rates. Bankruptcies and defaults could accelerate. No fucking shit. No fucking shit. Already, corporate defaults this year are running at their fastest pace in more than a decade. For companies with public debt that trades on financial markets, outstripping the immediate after effect. Yep, this is just beginning. Again, office building bust, a banking crisis, the likes of which we've never seen before. Oh, major brands keep raising prices. Yep. Sales are down, but prices are up. There's no inflation. Go fuck off. And we raise prices. Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, you keep eating. That's wonderful stuff to drink. It's wonderful. Oh, I love it. I love it. Yep. Dragflation, economy going down, inflation going up. Lending in the commercial real estate shrank for the first time since 2021. A sign that higher mortgage rates and tighter credit conditions are weighing on the sector. No shit. Well, if Bloomberg's talking about it, then it must be true. This is an article in USA Today. Today. Zelensky is in a box. Some experts say Ukraine won't win the war. No fucking shit. Blow me away. We only said they couldn't win the war when the war began. U.S. lost every war since World War II, but is telling Ukraine how to beat Russia. And we go on to say, we forecast Russia will soon defeat the Ukraine army. Well, we weren't precisely right in that, but when we wrote this back in March, just days after the Russian invasion, everyone was saying the opposite, that Ukraine would win. And now Russia controls over 20% of Ukraine, or about 20%. And other articles. It's not the only one. One after another. We've had these articles up saying that Ukraine would lose. I've been saying it over and over and over and over. And there's your cover of Trends Journal magazine. Don't count on the counteroffensive. So they quote this guy. Some experts, however, say a stalemate is the most likely scenario. What's stalemate? It's bullshit. Sean McFate, a professor at Syracuse University, a place up north of me in that fucking hellhole, Syracuse. Oh, he's a professor. He's a professor. I got to listen to him. Fuck you, Celente, and Scott Ritter and Douglas McGregor for saying that Ukraine was going to lose. We got to listen to the professor. Here's what the professor says. And what else? Oh, then there's Israeli protests going on. I just want to read you a little bit about the hypocrisy and the lunacy. The hypocrisy that you cannot condemn Israel. They could do anything they want to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but Israel's religion could do anything they want to anybody, particularly the Palestinians. You ready? They're talking about the protesters that they lost now because the judicial reform, first part of the act, has gone through. Some of the protesters have driven 4 hours the far north to get to Jerusalem on Tuesday, a day after, you ready? This is New York Times language. Ultra-religious government passed a law limiting the powers of the High Court. Ultra-religious government. You don't believe in what I believe? I am an ultra-religious person. You only are supposed to believe in the religion I believe in. You have no freedom. It was the first step in a larger judicial overhaul plan that opponents fear will undermine Israeli democracy and the rule of law, end quote, from the New York Times. When all else fails, they take you to war. Watch the war, watch Israel and their ultra-Orthodox religious leaders escalate the murder of more Palestinians, bombs away in Lebanon, and let's get something going with Iran. They're going to ramp this thing up.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
There's this moment now. The Republicans in Congress were having a hearing about censorship, and they call RFK. Now, is this opportunistic by the Republicans? Of course, they're having this guy in because he's Joe Biden's biggest competitor, and they want to elevate him because he's damaging them. Of course, it's naked politics, but they're having this hearing about censorship, and the Democrats actually vote to censor RFK in the middle of it, and the vote fails. So they don't even get him censored. It's unbelievable that they don't even just have like the common sense to go like, this is going to make us look terrible. Like, let's not do this. But they somehow they're too removed from that to even like notice. But it was quite, just that alone was like such a spectacle that you're like, yes, thank you. That was so worth it. Just to show what lying, corrupt hypocrites these rulers of ours, how they really are.
Yeah, that's Monty Python at that point. We got to censor the censorship conversation, because if people see the conversation about whether or not we're censoring things, they won't trust us.
You know, there's something to, first of all, there's another dirty trick that's played here that gets played quite often. By the way, teach yourself to look for this trick, because it's one of the dirtiest tricks and it's so dishonest, is where if you make a comparison to anything, that's like viewed as equating it. You know what I'm saying? Like, so if you compare to something, they go, oh, so you're saying they're the exact same thing? So, oh, now you're totally downplaying how evil this evil thing was because you're comparing the two things. So for the example that always pops out into my mind was that the Libertarian Party of Kentucky, their state affiliate chapter there, they had that tweet about the yellow stars that went super viral. It was during the COVID passports when they tweeted something to the effect of like, oh, why don't we just put a yellow star on the unvaccinated? And immediately everyone goes, you're saying this is the same as the Holocaust. How dare you say that? And it's like, well, no, they're making a comparison between a society that started marking one group of people and saying they had limited rights that ultimately led to very bad situation. And it is totally reasonable to like say about a policy, they go, like it's almost like they treat it as if you were saying the Nazis were good, but clearly what they're saying here is objecting to anything that's even similar to a Nazi policy. So what would there's nothing to be offended about here, and it's completely legitimate to make a comparison. It's completely legitimate to just say, if the government came in tomorrow and said, we are going to set the price of wheat, and someone went, oh, what are we going to be Mao Zedong here and just collectivize all the farms or something like that? And if you go, so you're saying it's the same thing to just set the price of wheat than it is to collectivize all the farmland? Like, no, it's not the same. There are similarities here, and I'm making a comparison. I'm intentionally comparing it to something really horrible so that you see, hey, there's a little bit of horrible in this policy. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing offensive about that. And in fact, ironically, almost every time when people pull this bullshit tactic where they go, you compared a thing to a worse thing, therefore I'm outraged, they end up doing the same thing. Is on a theme, obviously, that we've been talking about for a while, but it has not been a good few days for Joe Biden. It seems like the temperature on the Hunter Biden scandals and their connection to Joe Biden has just been getting turned up and up and up for weeks now. We've speculated in the past that it's possible that there are some powerful interests who have been protecting Joe Biden for a long time who maybe aren't so interested in protecting him anymore. It is when you just take a step back and look at the situation. I was watching videos from Joe Biden in 2019 the other day. And it's at the time, I remember when we were doing our podcast and we were talking about how much Joe Biden had aged since he was vice president. So like from 2015, say to 2019, and being like, whoa, it was really apparent how much this guy had lost a step, how much he struggled to speak, quite frankly. But man, go look at videos from Joe Biden in 2019 and now look at videos in 2023. And it's like at least equally as drastic of a change. And I'm just saying, and this is speculating here, but just looking at him, it's very hard to see Joe Biden at any time, like any press conference he gives, any event he's at, anything, and to go, wait, how exactly is this going to work? How exactly is it going to work when he has to run a campaign and can't just hide in his basement? Like, how does that work? And it's hard to not at least speculate that like a lot of fucking powerful people in the Democratic Party must be trying to figure out what their options are. And so if nothing else, it just seems a little bit coincidental that you have these kind of these well-placed leaks. And all of a sudden, this information, which, by the way, nothing here is really new. This is all going back to stuff that happened when Joe Biden was vice president or shortly after. But now, all of a sudden, it's like the media has very noticeably, the corporate press has very noticeably pivoted from there's absolutely nothing to talk about Hunter Biden, you're insane if you think that, you're also probably a Russian spy, to like, oh yeah, no, obviously we always acknowledge there's a real scandal here and it's quite possible Joe Biden's involved.
I believe we will follow this all the way to the end, and this is going to rise to an impeachment inquiry the way the Constitution tells us to do this, and we have to get the answers to these questions.
All right, so I guess the big story here, is that look, you got the Speaker of the House bringing up impeachment for the first time. Now, whether this will actually happen, I do not share. I do not share McCarthy's view that we will get to the bottom of this. Probably not. What's more interesting to me is almost you're like, hey, look, if they're going to get Joe Biden out of the way and get some other nominee in here, this does have to start happening pretty soon. Like there's still time, you know what I mean? There's still a decent amount of time before the primaries start. There's still a lot of time before the general election, but there's not that much time if you're trying to get this guy out of the way. And it seems like if that's the plan, then this is the beginning of that. This is the beginning of putting that pressure on Biden. I heard a good theory. I did the Meat Hawk podcast recently. I don't remember the exact title of it, but they got a good podcast going. So I did that podcast recently, and this was the first I had heard of this or thought of this, but it sounded like a plausible play by the Democratic Party is to keep Biden in the game long enough that they don't have to do primaries, and then once they're past that process, swapping him out for Newsom. Interesting. Which I guess would be a play to box out RFK.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Let the NPCs live imprisoned in 15-minute cities under constant surveillance, wearing masks and submitting to endless, useless vaccines or worse. Let them survive on UBI issued in CBDC with digital IDs that track their every move from cradle to grave. Let them forego real meat and eat synthetic meat, toxic vegetables, and bugs. Let them submit to smart city technologies that track their carbon footprints and issue their social credit scores so they feel like good, compliant citizens. Let them have their Marxism, critical race theory, transgenderism, and servility to the ever-burgeoning state. Let them think that they are radicals while they serve as the foot soldiers and accomplices of the globalist elite. It's time to separate from these people. No reconciliation is possible. The only question is whether the totalitarians they serve will let us out. Hello and welcome to Wrecked, the Michael Rechtenwald podcast. Recently, and you're not alone in this amongst libertarians, I think, you've expressed some agreement with and support. I'm not saying you're going to vote for him, but you've expressed some support for Robert F. Kennedy Jr. What do you like about him?
Well, there are some things I don't like about him and that have also actually emerged in recent days and weeks. But the thing is, given the things he's good on, I don't know if I want to say I can overlook other things, but yeah, maybe I can overlook other things because he's so good on so many things that matter. Like I sometimes think about somebody like Bill Weld, former governor of Massachusetts, Libertarian Party vice presidential candidate. I mean, this guy is a stuffed shirt if you ever saw one. And maybe he's good on some wonkish policy thing or whatever. But I think about issues that have affected me very, very dramatically, having to do with health, so-called public health, which I can't utter the term public health any longer without having contemptuous quotation marks around those words. But matters like that, the military-industrial complex. Could you imagine Bill Weld talking about the military-industrial complex? Not possible. It would never, ever, ever happen.
Right.
The surveillance state, he, as far as I can see, wants to pardon. Now, he says he's looking into the matter of Ross Ulbricht, so he's not as good as Vivek Ramaswamy, who says he would give clemency to all of them. But Snowden and Assange, there's no justification for what's been done to them.
You know, he is a standard welfare state liberal, you might say. And he's also what we might call a climate change conspiracy theorist, to throw one of their epithets back in their faces. Is there anything else you find truly terrible about his views?
Well, the other day, the New York Post misquoted him or gave people a false impression about one of his opinions. And in response to that, he's gone way overboard talking about his devotion to Israel and his dedication to the state of Israel. And this goes to show I'm not an anti-Semite. And it was a really pathetic display. And you would think he would be above that. But it goes to show, as outspoken and tough as he can be, there's only one Ron Paul in this world.
Recently, Yaron Brook, the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute, condemned you, Tom Woods, in a podcast, calling you anti-American and morally relativist. I don't know how he could call you the latter unless that is American foreign policy is considered absolutely correct no matter what, and any opposition must be deemed morally relativist. It seems that the ARI has taken the worst views of Rand, particularly her conflating of the liberty movement with U.S. militarism, and magnified them. Do you have any additional thoughts on this condemnation and this institute?
Yeah, I have zero concern about it. I wrote about it because, I write a daily newsletter, and this was like red meat. This was like a big old meatball right over the plate, for me to hit. Yeah. So I did it. But it seems like, at least with them, the institutionalization of objectivism has not led to good results. And it has led to, I don't know how to characterize it really, but I realized when this happened that it was 15 years ago that I wrote a blog entry at LouRockwell.com criticizing these exact people for their views on foreign policy, and in particular for their views on arguing that countries like the U.S. that stand for, quote, individual rights should not feel constrained in the way they conduct warfare when it comes to innocent civilian populations. They are to blame, those people in those countries. They are to blame, and they live in, quote, terrorist countries, which is these are supposed to be anti-collectivist thinkers. That's a collectivist concept, the idea of a, quote, terrorist country. And so we can do what we want because our regime is enforcing individual rights. And it seems to me that's moral relativism. We can carry out all sorts of moral enormities, but because we're doing it in the name of this, that, or the other thing. And half the time we are doing it in the name of imperial ambition, enriching fat cats. And it's very quaint to see the sweet, naive people at the Ayn Rand Institute think that when the U.S. government explains why it's doing something, it's always giving you the true explanation. It's to fight for democracy and this, that, and the other thing, and individual rights. And they just jump right on board for that. Absolutely. That is what it is all about. And you think, geez, how much clearer could these people make it that this is not what drives them? Especially when you look at the regimes they choose to wrangle with and the regimes they coddle, doesn't seem to leave a very distinct pattern, But so to hear them taking this all at face value, and then having taken it all at face value, never once talking about the military-industrial complex, the problems there, the incentives there, not once, but then is suggesting that we could just absolutely lay waste. We could use nuclear weapons if we wanted to against a foe. Again, to me, that it looks like that's moral relativism. That, well, as long as the U.S. government says it's okay, then incinerating all those people is fine. Now, you as a private individual probably shouldn't go incinerate people, but if the U.S. regime is doing it, we know they have good intentions because go read the Constitution for yourself. I mean, it's like, I think one article is all I need for this.
Yeah, I guess they also support the proxy war in Ukraine.
Well, of course. If the establishment tells them jump, they say how high.
Yeah. Well, it does throw the Mises Institute into relief with that. In fact, it shows the difference between objectivism as practiced, at least today, and libertarianism as upheld by the Mises Institute. The Mises Institute in particular doesn't fall for this kind of militarism, and it doesn't fall for this kind of defense of the regime at all costs and at the cost of all principles.
And by the way, I say this as somebody who rather likes Ayn Rand. You know, obviously, as with anybody, I have some disagreements, some major, some minor. But some of the things she did were very, very impressive. Her nonfiction, which most people overlook, is really, really biting and devastating. But in her fiction, she's got, in Atlas Shrugged, the passage about the 20th Century Motor Company. And at this company, they were going to implement, actually in the functioning of their company, the principle from each according to his ability to each according to his need. And that sounds like a very noble principle. But as you watch it unfold, as somebody, she's telling us this story through the voice of a worker who worked at the 20th Century Motor Company. And you watch it unfold and you realize every stage of this unfolding horror is completely plausible. This is exactly how it would go. And I find it to be such a convincing passage that, okay, I suppose it's my next daughter's turn now, I realize, but I have been reading this passage to each daughter of mine as they get old enough to understand it, because I believe this one story alone is enough to inoculate you against this kind of stuff. It is so compellingly written. So now, Amy Woods, it's your turn for Dad to read you the 20th Century Motor Company passage from Atlas Shrugged. It's absolutely great. So I don't go into, it's not that I'm going into this, I don't like Ayn Rand. I think she was a very, very impressive woman.
Yeah, absolutely. And very prescient as well, because we're seeing this being implemented, this kind of philosophy within companies now with the stakeholder capitalism and the ESG index. This is actually happening as we speak.
And of course, she in some ways indirectly anticipated the kind of question you opened this conversation up with, which is, are we dealing with stupid or evil? Because she would say, given that we know that market economies have lifted more people out of poverty than any force anywhere in the world, if we have people who claim they want to help the poor, but they don't support the free market, I don't see why we automatically assume these are people of goodwill. Because the solution to your problem is staring you in the face and you can't even be bothered to look for it, then maybe there's something else motivating you. It could be envy. It could be a lust for destruction. It could be a desire to rule over people. Whatever it is, it ain't your pure desire to uplift them from poverty.
Yes, Dr. Paul, you mentioned that we're going to be talking about RFK Jr., and it's great to see him, even despite the desire to censor him and keep him out of the public eye, that he's doing so well with favorability. And when he was on Hannity recently, the town hall, I believe it was, he mentioned something that was so accurate, but there was a little tweak that I wanted to make. You know, he mentioned that we do not have a free market capitalist system in this country, and that is true. He said that there is cushy socialism for the crony corporatists. That's very true. But then he said something that I tend not to agree with, and he said that everybody else in the country lives under a brutal, savage, merciless capitalism. And with all due respect to him, and he is somebody that I greatly respect, I don't believe that that's true at all, because we have perhaps the biggest welfare state in the history of the world. I remember reading that 50% of our country, 50%, half, in some way receive federal money. Money is handed out to people who aren't even citizens. So that's how bad the socialism is on, outside of the corporations. So socialism is squeezing us from the top and from the bottom, and the middle class is being squeezed out from both sides. So there is no brutal, savage, merciless capitalism. First, that implies that capitalism is brutal, savage, and merciless. And we do not believe that that's the case, because it's just voluntary interactions between people. But we have a society-wide socialist problem, and no free markets, or very, very few pockets of freedom in our our economy. And I understand the appeal to, we need a safety net. I understand that, even though I disagree with it. I believe it can be and should be provided voluntarily through charities. But because when you get the government involved, it becomes a way of life. It becomes, the government gave me this for free, they should give me that for free. And our wants are unlimited. We could sit here all day and talk about our wants. And the politicians are like, yeah, I'll give you this for free if you vote for me. So it's a very vicious cycle, socialism. And it ultimately, you run out of everybody else's money. And that's why the problem is not just the crony corporatists, which is a very big problem. But we have the citizens are addicted to government money too.
That's for sure. That is, what are they doing about? What are they planning about? Is the war nearly over? And who's going to rebuild it? And I used to, half kiddingly, but I was really quite serious, we'd be voting on a foreign policy. I remember very early in my career in Washington, they were voting for money. I think it was in Lebanon or someplace. I said, you're going to send the money over there and spend all that money. Then you're going to have to spend money because those things will be turned against us. Well, that's tradition now. You buy all these weapons. Where did all the weapons go in Ukraine? But that's the reason you can't separate the two. It's not a foreign policy issue. It is a weapons industry. It's a weapons industry, and there's some very, very powerful people who can manipulate behind the scene and make a lot of money off it. And right now, they're getting more fearful that is maybe ending, because it looks like nobody in the next week or two are going to declare victory. And I think they're getting together. There's strong evidence that the same people who created this monster, this mess that we have, are going to plan their strategy on how they're going to take over the rebuilding of Ukraine, return to liberty and great prosperity. Well, I would advise people to be very cautious about the nonsense you hear about that.
On the topic of cronyism, there is no perfection in political systems. Every single combination you could think of has been tried, whether it be dictatorship or democracy or kings and dukes, and everything has been tried. Communism, socialism. There's no perfection, because people are imperfect. We will not create a perfect political system, and because we are creative, so the bad guys are always scheming on ways to enslave us, and we're always trying to figure out how to keep them off our backs. They break constitutions, people break laws, and find creative ways to avoid being enslaved, and life goes on. What you want, though, if you're going to do this, is the right incentive structure. And the free market, we believe, has the right incentive structure. As imperfect as a free market is, because it's made up of imperfect people, at least the incentives are there for entrepreneurs to risk their own capital, to satisfy consumers in the most efficient and profitable way. And when they succeed, they're rewarded with profits. And when they fail, they lose their capital, their money, and the money and capital flows to those who are satisfying consumers. Under corporatism, it's the opposite. They risk taxpayer money. They want government contracts, like what Dr. Paul mentioned, Ukraine. This is government contracts. We're going to go over there and rebuild using taxpayer money. And if they lose, so what? It's not their money. It's taxpayer money. They will perhaps get a taxpayer bailout if their lobby go well enough and claim that they're too big to fail. So the incentives for crony corporatism is not consumers. Their incentives is politicians, and their product doesn't even have to work. The vaccines are a perfect example of that. In a free market, those companies would be bankrupt by now. But in corporatism, not only does nobody get punished, they're exempt. Everybody's exempt. And the same is with military contractors. They don't have to help humanity do anything beneficial to humanity. It's all destruction. And if the tanks get blown up, they'll just make more tanks on our dollar, and that's it. So the free market, the incentives are in the right order. And that's why it's a far superior system. As imperfect as it is, because people are people, it's much, much better than the crony corporatism that we have today.
Another from a Europe newspaper, and it says, Zelensky, BlackRock CEO Fink, agreed to coordinate Ukraine investments. And, it's very blunt. People say, well, that's good. That'll rebuild it. Yeah, but I'll tell you what, they're going to divvy up the loot. They divvied up all the loot and the profits, when they were building all those weapons. But even they're making all these plans, and it looks like they're powerful beyond reproach. I predict that the market is still more powerful. They were able to manage and manipulate the Bretton Woods Agreement and a pseudo gold standard because we were so rich, so wealthy, and the only country that really survived World War II. And we threw our weight around, became the central banker of the world, and were able to, inflate the currency to our benefit. But that was special, but it lasted a long time. You don't know how long these events will last. But the one that we're going through now to try to adjust, we're seeing the conclusion of those many years they got away with building up debt. A lot of individuals and companies can borrow for a long time, but eventually, somebody might have 6 credit cards and they hit the maximum, and then some of the banks want their money back, and it doesn't work. And that's going to happen. This cannot happen. If it worked, nobody would have to work for a living. You just spend the money and spend it. And governments, in a way, get away with that. But right now, people have to remember what we need is liberty, we need freedom, we need economic understanding, and believe me, people need more confidence. I think that's what hurts the most. People lack confidence. They figure we have to do it. I don't think I can do it. I mean, we have to do our own merit, and they've been taught that you only get ahead by describing and having somebody tell you how miserable you are and how inept you are, and you need to hand out our money. So it's pretty hard to have confidence in being free. But that is really one of the biggest obstacles we have right now. We're going to do our very best at the Liberty Report to continue to promote our liberty.
Once again, the free market is being blamed for the recklessness and stupidity of the blockheads who rule us. Every 4 years, we are subjected to a pair of empty suits whose only real argument is over exactly how and through what channels they plan to squander Americans' wealth. It's enough to make the non-comatose segment of the population despair. So what can we do? Well, for starters, you can do what Ron Paul does, which is to start your day by reading LouRockwell.com. You can go to amconmag.com and read and subscribe to the American Conservative magazine, where you can read about conservatives who aren't bloodthirsty savages. But above all, today we have a special suggestion. If you're tired of having to choose between two wings of the same bird of prey, then help us change America. Go to campaignforliberty.com and join Ron Paul's Campaign for Liberty. H.L. Mencken put it this way. H.L. Mencken said, "The most dangerous man to any government is the man who is able to think things out for himself, without regard to the prevailing superstitions and taboos. Almost inevitably, he comes to the conclusion that the government he lives under is dishonest, insane, and intolerable. And so if he is romantic, he tries to change it." Isn't that a description of Ron Paul? Publishers Weekly says Ron Paul gives new life to old debates. Now, I love any compliment for Ron Paul, but I think that one's not quite right. Without Ron Paul, we wouldn't even be having these debates in the first place. Ron Paul reminds us that our future is not cast in stone, and that if we as a people so choose, we do not have to live in the kind of America that the two parties have in store for us. Either more domestic spending and bankruptcy, more warfare and bankruptcy. Those are our choices. Take your pick. We don't have to choose between these any longer. We can change this country through education. So thanks to all of you, people who came from all over this country, who have made sacrifices at times of great want and difficulty, who made it here and who have made sacrifices this whole year. Thanks to you. But above all, thank you, Ron Paul.